Hi, welcome to Learn Imba. I'm so excited to be offering this course because a Imba course on Scrimba.com is long overdue. That's because Scrimba.com was built using Imba. In fact, Scrimba was originally built as a way to teach people Imba. The creators of Scrimba are also the creators of Imba. Now, I've been a web developer for a long time, and I can't remember any web technology or framework that's got me more excited than Imba. I use it every day for all my projects, and for me it's replaced HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and React. So I'm really happy to be sharing what I find so cool about Imba with a wider audience. Imba is a programming language with beautiful syntax that compiles to JavaScript. It has first-class support for custom components, HTML tags, and styling. Those are all built into the language. You can use Imba as a replacement for JavaScript with a different syntax, or you can use its powerful features for building custom components to build full-fledged web applications. Imba is the fastest way that I know of to make web apps. And fast means you get more done, but it also means you can take things further and try more things. Imba is just so expressive. Take this screenshot here, for example. This is an entire drawing app in about 60 lines of code, and it's so readable. This is an example from the imba.io website, and you can click right there to go and try out this example in a live editor. Imba is so packed with sensible features that just make sense that after you learn it, going back to writing regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is just painful. So I apologize in advance. In this course, we're going to build a project called the Dopamina Box. And I got this idea from a Mike Boyd YouTube video where he made a hardware device to help keep him motivated to do a set of habits each day. The presence of this box with the lights on it just begging to be flipped created a positive association with doing the habits in his mind. So we'll build a software version of this. Let me show you a quick demo of it. So this is the Dopamina Box project that we'll build. You start out with this list of icons, and you can choose icons to represent the habits you want to do. So if I want to read every day, lift weights every day, and clean up a little bit every day, I'll choose those. And then when I come here, I can check off one of the habits. If I finish lifting weights, I'll check that off. And when I'm done with my last habit, I check it off. And I get that nice little sound effect, which is supposed to increase the positive association with completing my tasks in my brain. So we'll build this project together where you can add and remove habits, store the application data in local storage so it persists, and add sound effects. So in this course, we're going to learn all the basics of Imba syntax, which closely mirrors JavaScript and is easy to pick up. We're going to learn how to create custom UI components. We're going to learn about Imba's styling system, how to manage application state and handle events, and how to integrate your app with existing JavaScript and TypeScript code, and with any NPM module. Before starting this course, you should be confident with basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you know those, you'll be right at home, but if you don't, this course is going to be hard to keep up with, and you may want to take some of Scrimba's other web development courses first. I'm confident that you'll learn Imba by taking this course. Remember that Scrimba is an interactive platform. Most of the lessons have challenges where you can pause the lesson and write code yourself right inside of the Scrimba editor. So there's no development environment to configure and you can start coding immediately. And I want this course to work for you. I don't want you to feel bogged down by content that you already know. Feel free to use Scrimba's speed control, which is under the gear icon in the bottom right, to watch at a faster speed. Or skip over lessons or challenges that aren't relevant for you. I've tried to make the lessons fairly self-contained where possible. And be sure to take breaks. This is probably too much content to cover in one sitting. It's about 2 hours and 40 lessons. So feel free to come back and pick up where you left off. The first part of this course is all about the basic syntax of Imba, and then we move into building web apps with Imba's custom components, which is where the real magic is, and then we work on the project. I think it gets increasingly interesting as you build up those basic skills. Now, although this course covers a pretty full range of Imba topics, there's always more to learn, and I've linked to a couple of the best resources for doing that right here. The first is imba.io, which has the Imba documentation. It's full of useful code examples and is pretty comprehensive. The second is the Imba Discord community, which is another fantastic resource because it's full of people who are happy to answer your questions. And I'm a participant on there myself, so I may end up answering your questions. And last, a little more about me. My name is Nathan Manousos, and I've worked as both a designer and a developer at a variety of startups, including my own company, Flinto. You can learn more about me on my website, nathanmanousos.com, follow me on Twitter, or watch my YouTube channel, which actually has a lot of Imba content. And also, you should check out my product, tasktxt.com, which was built with Imba. This is my first commercially launched product built totally with Imba. It's a notepad for organizing your tasks and attaching little timers to them to keep you focused as you work. Okay, it's time to start learning Imba. Go ahead and move on to the next lesson and we'll get started. So we're looking at an Imba file, and this is Imba code. When I save this file or click reload on the browser here, it's going to run this code. And in this case, it says console.log, so we see a message gets logged to the console. The important thing to know about Imba code is that it's all compiled to JavaScript, and the JavaScript is what runs. So every line of Imba has an equivalent line of JavaScript. I'm going to type out what this line would be compiled to as JavaScript. It's exactly the same as the Imba line, except there's a semicolon right here at the end. So what's the point of writing Imba code if all it does is save us from writing semicolons? Well, there's a lot that Imba does that JavaScript doesn't. Let me give you another simple example. You can optionally remove the parentheses around function calls. So this would actually result in the exact same compiled JavaScript. I'm going to run this file again just to prove that it works. And that results in the exact same compiled JavaScript, even without the parentheses. Let me show you another cool Imba feature. I'm going to define a variable here called name. Set it equal to my name, Nathan, and I want to interpolate this value name into this string. To do that in JavaScript, you'd have to use a template string and then this $ curly brace syntax, and then you could put name there. In Imba, it's much easier. You can use your regular old string and just 2 curly brackets like that and put name in there, and you'll see that the syntax is a little more friendly, a little more simple, and that's going to be a theme in Imba code, right? Like, how much easier is that? Okay, let's run it to make sure it works. Cool. Now I'm going to comment out these lines. And you've probably seen by now that Imba uses hashtags for comments. Okay, now I'm going to paste in some more examples for us to take a look at. For each of these examples, I've written the compiled JavaScript equivalent of the above line in a comment below it, just for our reference. All right, so the first one, it's a variable called numHabits equals 5. The JavaScript is pretty much exactly the same, but with that semicolon. Not very exciting. Let's look at this next one. Same deal. Habit complete equals false. The JavaScript is nearly identical. In Imba, though, you have the option to use yes and no instead of true and false. So we might use yes. And in Imba, you can name variables with a question mark at the end of the name. So this is great for a Boolean because it reads like habit complete instead of habit complete. Makes your code a little bit more readable. Now, because JavaScript itself doesn't actually support using a question mark in the name, Imba inserts this special character behind the scenes into the JavaScript. Here's an array definition. And a cool thing you can do in Imba is you can break this onto multiple lines, and in doing so, we can remove the commas in between the items. I think that's a lot more clean, makes it easier to reorganize these things. And here's an object definition. Same thing, we can break this onto multiple lines. In doing so, we can remove the commas. But not only can we remove the commas, we can also remove the curly braces. So even more minimal. I love how this looks. And the compiled output is still going to be exactly the same. Okay, now I want you to try writing some Imba code. I'm going to paste in a little prompt here for you to follow, and you're going to be able to pause the video and type your code directly in here to try it out. Just remember to reload the browser or click run or save the file to run your code. What I want you to do is use console.log to print out the name property from this habit details variable, and then use JavaScript's built-in string.toUppercase method to print the result in all capitals. So you can give that a try on this line here, and then I'll show you how to do it. All right, so here's how we do that. Console.log. The parentheses are optional, so I'm going to leave them off. Say habit details.name.toUppercase. I'm going to save the file. You can see the correct result in the console. That's great. Now, the reason I wanted you to use this toUppercase method is just to demonstrate that the whole world of JavaScript methods and techniques are available to you if you're writing Imba code. Imba code is very close to JavaScript. We've seen in these examples that the compiled results are very similar to the Imba code that we're writing. So if you ever think, how do you do some certain task in Imba? The answer is very likely it's however you would have done it in JavaScript. You're just writing it with Imba syntax. But of course, Imba goes beyond JavaScript, and I think in these lessons, your mind is going to be blown continually by the cool things that Imba can do. Okay, let's learn about conditionals in Imba. I've got a few variables here. Num, which represents the number of habits that need to be completed in a day. Done, which is the number that have been completed. and then message, which is a string that we're going to populate. Now I'm logging to the console here. Are we done yet? And at the bottom, I'm logging the value of message. So we're going to use conditionals to populate the value of message and answer the question, are we done yet? Done meaning have we done all of our habits? And these comments here represent the different topics that we're going to cover. Let's start with a really simple if statement. So we can say if num triple equals done, message equals yes. Okay, let me open up the console and we can see that it logs yes because done does equal num. And let's look at the syntax of this if statement. First of all, the condition here doesn't need to have parentheses around it. The next thing to notice is that the body of the if statement is indented in one level. There's no curly braces because Imba is a white space sensitive language. That means that the tab characters, the indentation, is meaningful to the language. It's how Imba knows that this is the body and that it's nested under this if line. Okay, let's add an else. We'll say message equals no. And let me change done up here. Instead of 4, let's make it 3 so that we get the no value. And let's add a else if. We'll say else if done is greater than 0, message equals almost. Okay, so now we're getting almost. Imba has a shorthand for else if. You can write ELIF, elif. You can use it either way, but we'll tend to use the elif form. Okay, so there's a really simple if, else chain. I'm going to comment that out, and we'll go to the next topic here, which is trailing conditionals. I really love this. Let's make an example where we say message equals yes if done triple equals num. Okay, and let's set done to be 4 again so that it is equal to num. And you see that we get yes in the console. And what we've got here is a condition that trails after the line. That's why we call it a trailing conditional. So this lets us have a single line for this condition, but also it makes the code very readable. It reads like English. Message equals yes if done equals num. So the condition is here, and if it's true, this line will be executed, otherwise it'll be skipped. Okay, Imba also has a unless keyword. So instead of if, we could write unless. So we could say unless done triple equals num, message equals no. And that's not being executed now because these are equal, but let's make done equal to 3 again. And we see that we get no. And that's because unless is like the opposite of if. It negates the condition here. So this is like writing if done does not equal num, but you can write it with the unless keyword to make it a little more readable if you like that. And a really cool thing here is that we can take this unless statement, let me comment it out, and then I'll paste up here under our trailing conditional example. You can use unless also as a trailing conditional. So something like this, it's the same as the multi-line version, but again, it's one nice compact line and it's so readable. Message equals no, unless done equals num. Okay, here I wanted to make a quick note about and or. We could say message equals not yet unless done triple equals num or done equals 0. So check it out. You can use the word or. In JavaScript, you'd have to write the double pipe symbol, which also works in Imba. You can use that, and that means or you can use the actual English word or. The same thing works for and. If you were going to use the double ampersand operator, you could instead use the word and. I'm going to switch that back to or, and I'll comment this out. And let's look at a single line conditional. You may be familiar with the ternary operator in JavaScript, which looks something like this. We'll say done equals num question mark yes colon no. So the ternary operator is the operator that nobody knows how to say and nobody knows how to use. No, but we know how to use it, right? This is the condition, question mark, then what happens if it's true, colon, and then whatever happens if it's false. But the syntax is a bit weird, right? It's a little confusing. A lot of people find it strange. Imba, of course, has a nicer way to write that. The regular ternary logic that I just showed you works, but you can also write it like this. Message equals if done equals num, then yes, else no. So once again, it reads much more like English, a little more clear. You can use this form if you like it. Okay, it's time for you to try this. I'm going to give you a little challenge. I'm I'm going to comment out this message line and this line at the top, and we don't need this one either. And move all this stuff down. And I'm going to add a new variable here called isWeekend equal to no. Okay, I've pasted in your challenge prompt. And here's what I want you to do for the challenge. You're going to create a conditional, a set of if and else statements that satisfies this description here. If it's the weekend, and notice we have the isWeekend variable representing whether or not it's currently the weekend. If it is the weekend, log to the console, take the day off. Unless some habits have already been completed, then you're not going to log anything. On a weekday, if all the habits are done, log you did it. If no habits are done, log get going. And if some habits are done, log keep it up. Okay, so all these logs, you can use console.log directly to log those rather than that message variable we had before. Go ahead and write your code here, and then I'll come and show you how to do it. All right, here's how we can do that. We'll say if is weekend, console.log, take the day off, unless, I'll use that trailing conditional, some habits have already been completed, which means done is greater than 0. Okay, else, meaning if it's a weekday, if done triple equals num, console.log, you did it. Else if, we'll use the elif form, no habits are done, so done triple equals 0, console.log, get going. Else console.log, keep it up. Okay, so we're getting keep it up, which means it's not the weekend, and we've done some habits. If we did no habits, we'd get going. If we had all the habits done, we have you did it. And if it's the weekend, we get nothing because it doesn't print out anything if you've done some of the habits. But if you've done 0 habits and it's the weekend, it says take the day off. Cool, so that all works. And we're using the trailing conditional here with the unless keyword. And also notice that inside of this else, we have yet another if-else chain, and we indent 1 level for that, and then we're indenting 2 levels for this stuff. So remember, to indicate that something is nested within something else, you indent 1 level. Looping through arrays in Imba is super easy. We can use the for keyword, and I have an array here of habits, strings representing the names of different habits. So we'll say for habit in habits. And then I'm just going to do console.log habit. So this is a for loop. We're looping through the variable habits. Habit is a name that we're choosing that's going to represent each item in the array as it loops through. And then I'm logging that value here. So let's open up the console, and we can see our list of habits is printed out. Super easy syntax for looping through an array. We can also add a comma here and then add another variable name for the index of each iteration. So we could maybe log that as well, habit and index. So we see clean 0, run 1, study 2 in the console. Let's change this to a string and we'll interpolate these values. So I'll put index +1 colon habit. Okay, so now we have a nice numbered list. Next, I want to show you that Imba has a really easy way to loop a specific number of times. We can do that using what's called a range. So just like before, we're going to create a for loop, and this time I'm going to say for num in, and then I'm going to put something that looks like an array, and this sort of generates an array on the fly for us that we can loop through. And I'm going to say 0.5. That means a range from 0 up to 5. And it will not include 5. It's going to go 5 times starting from 0. Then we'll say console.log num. And in the console, you'll see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 5 iterations of this loop. A really easy way to loop a specific number of times. And you could put different numbers here. We could start from 2 and go up to 5. These could be variables. So it's pretty flexible. Okay, I've pasted in a challenge so that you can try using Imba's loop features. What I want you to do is print out 3 days worth of this little habit worksheet. So it has a header that says day 1, and then it has 3 rows printing out each of the habits from our habits array. And they start with a little checkbox made with these square brackets. And then it prints out day 2, same 3 habits, and then day 3, same 3 habits. The idea is that you're printing out like a worksheet where you can check these off each day. So go ahead, give that a try. Use the loops that we learned to try to create this little worksheet. All right, here's how we can do that. We'll say for num in 0.3. That's going to be to loop through our 3 days. So I'll say console.log day num plus 1 because it's going to be starting at 0. And we'll just check in the console that we've got day 1, day 2, and day 3. Now nested within here, we're going to say for habit in habits, console.log. And we'll have a string where we put in these square brackets to represent a little checkbox. And then we'll use string interpolation to put in the value of habit. And there we go. We've got our little habits worksheet. Let's learn how to do functions in Imba. Functions in Imba are created using the def keyword, followed by the name of the function. I'm going to create a function called createHabit, and it's going to return an object with name. And this is going to represent a habit that I want to complete. So this will be exercise. And then I'll have a property called done, whether or not this habit has been completed. So I'll say false. And let's call the function. So I'm going to do console.log first and then create habit, call the function, and we'll print out the output. Okay, we see our object. Great. In Imba, instead of putting empty parentheses to call a function that has no parameters, you can use an exclamation point. Works the same as the empty parentheses. I just wanted you to be aware of that because you'll see it around in Imba code. But I'm going to add some parameters to this. So let me put those back. And you put the parameters right after the function name. You don't need parentheses here. And I'm going to have a parameter called name, and then comma, a parameter called done. So instead of this string, I'll use name. And instead of this Boolean, I'll put done. And I want done to have a default value of false. Okay, let me save that. Oh, name is undefined. We got to pass in something. So I'll say clean up. All right, so now we have the value printing out and we can pass in the name and done as we like. Now I want to add one more item to the object here, which is going to be a created at timestamp. So I'm going to say const timestamp equals date.now. And if you want, you can use exclamation point to call date.now if you like how that looks. And then I'm going to say created at timestamp. Okay, so we have one more property now in our object that gets outputted. An important thing to know about functions in Imba is that they use implicit returns. This means that the last executed line of the function is returned automatically. So you don't need the return keyword. So if I delete that, rerun this, everything still executes just the same. This value gets returned back. Let's take a look at the compiled JavaScript output from this Imba function definition. So here's the actual JavaScript that it turns into. And you can see that it's basically the same. It's what you would have written in JavaScript. It inserted the return keyword for us. So I just always want you to keep in mind that the Imba code you write translates pretty directly into JavaScript. Okay, I'll delete that. And I want to create another function called prettyHabit, def prettyHabit. This is going to take in a habit, and it's going to return a nicer string representation of that habit instead of just printing out the object all the time. So we can say habit.name inside of a string. And I'm not putting the return keyword here because the last line of the function always gets returned. Okay, let's put prettyHabit around our habit. So prettyHabit takes in a habit, createHabit returns a habit. Now we just get the name of the habit printed out. But I also want to put a little checkbox thing at the beginning of the prettyHabit. So I'm going to make another function called check, and it's going to take in a habit. And I'm putting that here, interpolating it into the string. So let's make that function. We'll make a new function called check, takes in a habit, and we'll put if habit.done. If it's done, I want to return a little checkbox thing like that. Otherwise, if it's not done, I want an empty checkbox like that. Now in JavaScript, you might put return here and return here to return these strings. But in Imba, if statements evaluate to a value, so you can return the entire if statement. But because of implicit returns, we don't even need to do that. We don't need a return statement at all, and this code will work. If we want to make this a little more compact, I can put then here, and I can move it onto one line. And you can even move the function body onto the same line as the function signature, as long as you separate the function signature using the do keyword from the function body. So now we have a nice one-line function. And I can do that with this one as well. And let's run this. We can see that the little checkbox shows up. If we make this true, now it has an X. Cool. So not everybody is going to like compacting these functions into a single line like this, but I find it kind of useful. I like to move little utility functions out of the way if they're one line, make them more compact, but it's up to you how you want to handle that. Okay, to prepare for your challenge, I'm going to change this into an array of habits. So we'll say const my habits equals, and then we'll have an array, and I'll paste in a few items here, and let's make these different. So I'll say exercise, that one will be false, and this one will be eat healthy. Okay, now here's your challenge. Create a function called print habits. It's going to take one parameter called habits, which is an array of habits. That'll be the my habits variable here. And the function should loop through each habit, log the habit to the console using our pretty habit function to make sure that the output looks pretty. Now I've already put a call to the print habits function here with my habits as the parameter. So all you have to do is define the print habits function above that, and then you can run the code, see if it works. Go ahead and pause the video now, and you can give that a try. Okay, here's how I would do it. We'll say def print habits. The parameter is called habits. In here, we're going to have a loop for habit in habits, console.log, pretty habit, and in there, we're going to put habit. So we've got a for loop going through each item of the array. Each item in turn is going to be assigned to habit. We'll use pretty print and pass in habit, console.log the result of that. And let's see what we get. We open up the console and we have a nice looking checklist of our habits. Okay, we're going to learn how to do anonymous functions in Imba. I've written an example of a JavaScript anonymous function here in a comment. And so how do we write this same thing in Imba? Well, we can write it with the do keyword that starts an anonymous function. And then if I just put the string hello, that's what gets returned. And that's actually the equivalent anonymous function. Let's assign it to a variable. And there you go. You have the exact same thing. Now we may want to put a parameter here like name and then concatenate that so that we get a greeting hello name. To do the same thing in Imba, we can put parentheses after the do keyword, put name there, and I could interpolate it like that. So let's try it out. Console.log, greeting, Nathan, hello Nathan, cool. Now a common situation where you need to use an anonymous function is for a callback function. So to do an example, I put an array of names here in a variable called names. And let's do this. We'll say names.map, greeting. So the map function takes a callback, which means it takes a function as an argument, and it's going to pass each item of this names array into this callback function and make a new array out of the results. This is a built-in JavaScript function, just making use of it because it uses a callback. Okay, so let's log the result of that. Console.log names.map. We get hello Nathan, hello Donna. Now we might want to put this function right in line instead of defining it as a variable. So let me just cut that out and I'll paste it in here right in line. We get the same result. And a cool thing you can do in Imba is you can actually have the callback trailing the call to the function. So after that last parameter, you can have your callback. And what Imba will do is it'll insert it as the last parameter. So actually, if you had other parameters to the map function, which map function just needs the one callback, but let's say that this was a function with other parameters, Imba would insert the callback as the last parameter. But because map has no other parameters needed, we can just delete all of that, including the parentheses, and have the callback trailing like this. And we can break this onto multiple lines, and we could write, a more lengthy function body here if we wanted. Another commonly used JavaScript function that takes a callback is set timeout. So the set timeout function first takes a callback as its first parameter, followed by the number of milliseconds to wait before calling that callback. So let's try defining a callback right here. I'm going to say do console.log hello. Now Imba gets a little confused here about whether this comma is part of the callback's function body or not. So we'd have to wrap this in parentheses to do it this way. And now it'll work. You can see when I hit reload, wait 1 second, and there's the message. And if we wanted to break this onto multiple lines, as we often do because our function bodies are often more than one line, you could do it like this. But this is starting to look ugly. This is like the kind of thing we're trying to avoid by using Imba. This looks more like JavaScript code with all these extra parentheses down here. It would be so much nicer if setTimeout used the second parameter as the callback, because then we'd be able to write that trailing callback like this, and this would look so much nicer. Well, Imba's got us covered in this situation. What it does by default is take the callback and insert it as the last parameter. But in setTimeout, we need it to be the first parameter. So there's a special symbol you can use if you type an ampersand as the first parameter, or whichever parameter you need it to be. It will insert the callback in place of the ampersand. So now it'll take this callback, insert it here as the first parameter. There's our hello. We get the same result, but this much nicer syntax. So that's a great example of some very clean, nice Imba syntax. When you're working with APIs that involve callbacks, you get to enjoy these nice trailing callbacks that make your code nice and readable. People who are new to Imba often wonder if they can import NPM modules or other modules that they've defined. And you'll be pleased to know that you can, and it all works perfectly. So I've installed a dependency here called nanoid, and let me just show you that it works. So we'll say import nanoid from nanoid. This is just a package from NPM, and we'll do console.log nanoid. Now nanoid is a unique identifier generator, and it's just a simple example for me to show you that this works. So when I save, it logs out a unique ID string. So you can import any package from NPM, import it into your project, and it will work along with your Imba code. You can also import modules that you define in your own project. So I can say import to ms from /helpers.imba. And let me just show you console.log to ms. Okay, so it logs something. That means it's working, it imported it. Let's take a look at this helpers.imba file. And you can see it defines two objects, to ms and from ms. Each of these has seconds, minutes, hours, and days properties on it. And each of those is a little function that will convert milliseconds into seconds or from seconds into milliseconds. Okay, so just little helpers. Let me go back here and we see that it console.log shows the results of that object. Let's give it a value. So 2ms.seconds, and let's say we want to see 2 seconds in milliseconds. That should be 2000. Okay, so it just shows that it works. Now let's do from milliseconds to 1000. Let's try 3000, and that should return 3 because 3000 milliseconds, we're going from milliseconds to seconds, and we need to import from milliseconds. Okay, and we get 3 in the console. Again, just demonstrating that if you define your own Imba file that exports something, you can import it into another Imba file. And it works with basically the same exact syntax from JavaScript Node that you're probably familiar with. Now, another great thing is that you can also import from JavaScript files. So I have a JavaScript file here in my project. If you have some existing JavaScript code or you just want to write some of your code in JavaScript, you can do that and import it into your Imba code, no problem. Also within this JavaScript file, you can see that it imports from helpers, which is the Imba file we just looked at. So this JavaScript file is importing from an Imba file. It also imports another NPM module called date functions that I've installed as a dependency in the project. And I'm importing that using this wildcard to say import star as df from date functions. So I'm getting the entire date functions library in a value called df. And you can see how I use it here. And date functions is just a library for handling dates and times. So let's take this function that's being exported from this file that has a really long name, and let's go back to our index file and say import, and I'll put that really long name. And I don't want to use that long name, so I'm going to say as format, so to kind of put an alias for it, from ./format.js. Okay, so this syntax of putting an alias here is just the same as in JavaScript. And let's say console.log format, and I'll put 1000 times 60 for 1 minute times 15 for 15 minutes. Okay, and so that function prints out, a string representation of this number of milliseconds. But I shouldn't have to do this math here, right? Because that's what that other 2ms thing is for. So let's just do 2ms.minutes, and I'll try 125. Let's see what that gives us. 2 hours and 5 minutes. Cool. So just some time formatting functions here, but what these functions do is not important. The important thing in this lesson is that you can use familiar syntax for importing things to import from NPM modules, from Imba files in your project, or from JavaScript or TypeScript files in your project. All right, let's take a quick look at how classes are defined in Imba. Classes are created with the class keyword. I'm going to name this class habit, and you can put properties and methods in here. Properties are defined with the prop keyword. I'm going to have a prop called name, a prop called done. That will default to false. And I'll have a prop called created at. You can create a constructor method using the constructor keyword. This is going to take a name argument, and we're going to say name equals name. You could say self.name to specify that we're referring to the name property and that this is the name argument, but Imba is smart enough to work that out on its own, so we don't need to worry about it. Then I'm going to say created at equals date.now. Okay, so there's our little class. I'm going to instantiate it. I'm going to say const habit equals new habit. The syntax for instantiating objects is the same as in JavaScript. I'll say exercise, and then let's just do console.log habit, just to see that our instance exists and that it worked. And you can see the done there has a little weird symbol after it. That's how Imba allows you to add a question mark in a variable name. Okay, let's add a method here. I'm going to make a method called toString, and it'll say if done, then, and it's going to print out a string with a little x, and then else a checkbox that's not checked off with the same name value interpolated into it. Okay, now we can do console.log toString. We'll call that method, and we get a nicer output in our console. Okay, I've got a quick challenge for you. Here it is. I want you to make a method on habit called toggle, and that method should just toggle the value of done. So set it from false to true or true to false. Go ahead and give that a try now. All right, here's how we could do that. I'll say def toggle done equals not done. And then to make sure that it works, we'll say habit.toggle. And then we'll log this out again after it's been toggled so we can see it's off and then it turns on. And we can try it again just to be sure that it turns off again. So that's the very basics of classes in Imba. There's a little bit more to know about them, and you can read all about it on imba.io. We'll also learn a little bit more as we build the project, but for now I just wanted you to have a basic familiarity with the syntax of class definitions in Imba. Okay, it's time to start learning how to make web applications using Imba. First, let's look at what we've got in our project here. I'm going to click over to index.html, and we see a really bare bones HTML file. The only interesting thing here is that this script tag includes an index.imba file. And you may think, I thought browsers could only understand JavaScript. Why are you able to include a Imba file here? Well, there's a build system behind the scenes in this Scrimba project that's compiling Imba files into JavaScript on the fly as needed. So we can basically just treat Imba files as if the browser understands them. Just remember that they're actually being compiled to JavaScript behind the scenes. I'll go back to index.imba, and that's the file that's being included into that index.html. So every time I reload our browser, it executes this script, and we see our console.log message. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm getting really tired of logging things to the console, and I want to see some actual web content appear in the browser. So how are we going to get web content into the browser? One way to do it would be to use these DOM APIs. Document.createElement div, that'll create a div element, and then inner text, and we can set the text inside of that div, and then we can append that div to the body using document.body.appendChild.myDiv. So let's reload the browser, and there we have our div in the browser. We could build a web application this way using these DOM APIs, but that's going to be really manual and labor intensive. Nobody wants to do it that way. We want to use a really advanced framework for building web applications. And what framework should we use? How about React? I've already included React here as a dependency. So let's import React and React DOM, and let's try doing the same demo, but using React this time. So I could say const my div equals react.createElement. It's going to be a div tag with no attributes, and the text content will be hello from React. Then we need to put this div into the DOM, so we can use React DOM.render. And we're going to put my div into document.body. Okay, let's try reloading the browser. And that works. We can see hello from React. Now, of course, in a real React app, we would use JSX to write this with code that looks like HTML. But we don't have that available to us here, so this is kind of the manual way to do it. But we can see that we've set up React, and we can create components, and we could build our web app now. But of course, we're not going to actually use React because Imba has its own way of doing this, its own way of creating component-based web applications. So let's see how to do that. First, I'm going to say const my div equals, and then I'll put a div tag, and I'll say hello from Imba. So you can see in Imba, tags are part of the language, and I can assign them to a variable. And to mount this into the body, I'm going to say imba.mount my div document.body. Okay, let's reload the page again, and we can see that the Imba way is also working now. We've mounted our div into the body. Now, this second attribute of imba.mount is optional. The default is document.body, so I'm just going to remove that. We should have the same result here, and there we go. We could actually take this and put it directly here instead of using a variable, and now we've got a nice one-liner version of that, and we can indent content inside of this. So I'm going to do tab, and then I'm going to say h1 hello. I'll make a UL tag here, and I'm going to put a couple of LIs inside of it, and I'll just say 1, 2. Okay, we see that in the browser. And notice in Imba, the tags don't have closing tags. So if you want to nest something inside of another tag, you indent it one level inside. So these LI tags are inside of the UL, and all of this is actually inside of this div, which if I bring this div down onto a new line like this, it's a little bit easier to see the nesting structure. And remember, this is all being interpreted as the first parameter to the imba.mount function. Also, all the text values are in quotes. That's because these are actual Imba data types that are being rendered here. And if I actually put an expression like 1 + 1, that's executed and the result is shown here. So unquoted values are interpreted as code. You can add attributes to your tags in the normal way that you would in HTML. So there's a title attribute. And you can add classes using a dot. So I could say ul.myList. You should avoid using the class attribute like this, and instead rely on that dot syntax. You can add multiple classes like this. You can even have them separated by a space. They can kind of go anywhere within that tag. Okay, it's time for a challenge. I'm going to paste in the challenge prompt here, and I want to delete all this code, but I'm going to just move it over here and comment it out and leave it for you as a reference. The challenge is to convert this HTML into Imba syntax. So this is just plain old HTML. I want you to write your answer here, copy this exact HTML, but change it into Imba's HTML syntax. Go ahead and pause, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so we have a details tag, and that has a class of Imba details. I hope you remembered to use the dot syntax instead of the class equals attribute. And then inside of there, we have a summary tag. And inside of that is Imba in quotes. Then we have a P tag, a cool programming language. And then below that, we have a href equals, and that's going to say learn more. Okay, no closing tags. Text content is all in quotes. Attributes are just like normal, except for classes use this dot syntax. Let's run it. And that works. By the way, did you know about this details tag? I only recently learned about the details HTML tag. Don't be fooled, this is an actual part of HTML. It's not an Imba feature or any kind of JavaScript thing. There's an actual HTML tag that does this kind of disclosure. In the next lesson, we're going to learn to create our own custom tags, which are the building block of dynamic web applications in Imba. In Imba, like many other component-based frameworks, we're going to create our application's UI using components. And in Imba, we typically call these tags. custom tags. So we're going to define our own custom tag. You can see right now that I'm mounting a div to our document, but let's define our own tag. So instead of div, we could have a tag called habit item. Tags are defined using the tag keyword followed by the name of the tag. Inside of here, it's a lot like a class definition. You can have props and methods, and there's one special method that you're almost always going to have, which is render. So I'm going to define a render method, and the render method's job is to return back an HTML template, starting with a special self tag. So inside of there, I'm going to put a div, and then I'll put the name of a habit, like exercise. Now, defining this tag doesn't actually do anything, just like defining a class doesn't do anything. It just makes the definition available to use, but we're not currently using it. And with a class, you can instantiate the class, and with a tag, we can make use of it by mounting it to the document. So instead of this div, I'm going to mount a habit item. So it's like we've created our own new type of HTML tag. You can see habit item mounted to the DOM, and the content shows up here. Let's add a little bit more. I'm going to put a label tag inside of here, and then I'll put a input type equals checkbox. So this kind of represents a habit that you can check off each day. And you can see these tags are nested inside of the label tag using indentation. Now, because the render tag is so common, every tag you create is probably going to have one, you can actually leave it off. And as long as the last part of your tag is an HTML template starting with self, Imba will know that that is the content of the render method, and you don't actually have to write def render, which makes your tag definition a little bit more streamlined. Now, we don't want to have a hard-coded name of a habit here. We don't want all of these to say exercise. We want to be able to use some sort of a variable that represents the name of a habit. So let's add a prop to our tag called name, and I'll set the default value of untitled. And then down here, instead of the string exercise, I'll use the prop name. So all the values inside of tags are actual Imba code. So if you want a string, it has to be in quotes. And if you put a variable, it's going to return back the value of that variable. Okay, now when I save, we see that default value of untitled is displayed here. So how do we pass in our own value? You know, with a class, you might pass in some values into the constructor that set props. With a tag, the props define attributes automatically. So now there's a name attribute just because I've defined a name prop here. So I can say name equals, and I'll put something like clean up. Now I'm going to put a div here to serve as a container, and I'm going to put a couple of habit items. I'll put exercise back in, and maybe one more, learn Imba. Okay, so you can see we can reuse this tag. We can provide different values for the name prop in each one. All right, now I want you to try writing a tag. So I'm going to paste in a little prompt here for you to follow. I want you to create a new tag definition, name it habit group, define a render method. Don't forget the self tag within render. And then inside of that self tag, put 3 habit item tags, and then replace the content of inba.mount with a single habit group. So I'll go ahead and do that part for you. I'll turn this into a habit group. And I'm going to comment these out because you might want to reference them. These 3 habit items should be the content of your habit groups render method. And you'll notice when I save now, the page is blank because I've mounted habit group, which doesn't exist. So you can go ahead and define that tag right here, and then I'll come show you how to do it. Okay, so to create that tag, we would say tag habit group, def render, self, and then we're going to put those 3 habit items. So I'll just cut and paste them from down there. There we go. Remember, we can remove render if we want to. That's optional. So I'll just indent those back. And there's our habit group tag. Looks good. Of course, we still have hard-coded items here. We want to generate these dynamically from a list. So we're going to learn how to do that next. Okay, so we have a problem with our habit group tag, which is that it has 3 hard-coded habit items. And it would make much more sense if this list was generated from some data source like an array. Then we'd be able to loop through the array and display a habit item for each iteration of the loop. But how do we do loops within our HTML template within Imba? Well, if you've used other web application frameworks, you may have noticed some funny syntax for doing loops. Something really nice about Imba is that you use the exact same looping syntax within your HTML templates that you do anywhere else. So you could type for animal in, and then I'll make a list of animals. And then here you indent one line, and you can put whatever HTML you want. And I can reference this value here, which is going to be assigned to each animal in turn. So I'll just say animal. Okay, and you see that it printed out a little list with a div for each one of those items. But of course, we don't want to print out animal names. We want to print out habits. So where are we going to get the array with our habits? Let's try adding a prop here called habits. I'll put the same names here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to change this so that we're not printing out an animal anymore. We're printing out a habit item. And this shouldn't be animal. This should be something like habit name. And then we're going to pass that name in here as the name prop. So we're only going to need one habit item, and we're going to move it up into here. But I want you to try it. Okay, so let's make this into a challenge. I pasted a little prompt here for you to follow. What I want you to do is to make this loop inside of habit group, iterate through the habits array, which is this variable, and display a habit item for each item of the array, and pass the appropriate name in as the name attribute. And then remove any example code about animals. So when you're done, you should just have this sort of a list and none of this stuff about animals. Give that a try, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so instead of looping through this array, we're going to loop through the habits array, and we can name each of those habit. And then instead of a div with animal, we're going to bring this habit item up here, and we're going to replace the hard-coded name with habit, which will be assigned to each of these strings in turn. Let's see if that works. Cool, it looks good. And now if I add a new item, it's added to the list. So now we have a dynamic list being built up from this data source, this array. And instead of defining this array with all of these values here, I'm going to delete all those values out so that we just have a default of an empty array. And then here where I use habit group, where I mount it, I'm going to pass habits in as a prop, and we'll pass the array in there. Great. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how to do conditional if-else statements within our HTML. Okay, to do conditionals within your HTML in Imba, it's very similar to loops in that it uses the same syntax for conditionals whether you're writing them within your HTML or not, which is unique compared to some other frameworks that have special syntax for loops and conditionals within tags. So a quick example of that is I could say if true, div, it's true. And we see that that's printed out. Of course, if I change it to false, that tag's no longer there. And we could add an else. And we see that. We can even do trailing conditionals like this. So I'll change it to be true. So this is div, it's true, if true. And we see that that's printed out. Okay, so there's a couple quick examples. Let's do a more realistic one. But before we do that, I want to add some data here to our array of habits. So right now it's just an array of strings, but I want to turn this into an array of objects so that we can put a little bit more data for each of the habits. We'll have a name property and then a done property that represents whether this habit is done for the day. So I'll go ahead and fill in the rest of these. But now when I reload, I get an error, and that's because right here we're passing in habit, which is a reference to one of the items of this array, which previously was a string, but now it's an object. And a string is expected, so all we have to do is get the name property off of the habit, so we'll use habit.name, and now we're back where we were. But we also now have access to this additional property, which is done. So maybe we want to hide habits that are done. We could say unless habit.done, and then I'll indent this habit item inside of there. And now this is only going to be displayed if habit done is false. And we can see for one of them it's true, so study should be missing now. Let's save this, and we see study is gone. Okay, that would also work as a trailing conditional, which might look nice. But let's remove that, and instead let's pass done into habit item. We're going to make a new prop on habit item. So we'll say done equals habit.done. And then up here on habit item, let's define that prop. Done equals false, so the default value will be false. And let's make use of it within the habit item tag. As a quick example, let's just print out done right here. And we can see false, false, true, false. But instead of printing it out, let's use it as the checked attribute for this input. So now if the item is done, the checkbox is checked. And let's try making another one done just to see if it works. Great. Now I want you to try writing a conditional. So I've pasted in another challenge prompt up here. And what I want you to do is, if the habit is done, display it with a line through it, which you can do by using the S tag. S is for strike through. So use a conditional here around the name of the habit item to check if it's done. And if it is, display it with an S tag. And if it's not, just use the div tag like we have here. Go ahead and give that a try, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so we can wrap a conditional around this. We'll say if done, S name, else div name. And now we see the ones that are done are crossed out. Now you may have tried checking these and noticed that it doesn't actually update. And that's because this checkbox doesn't affect the original data source here, so it's not actually changing the done value. So of course, we'll be looking at how to address that in a future lesson. Okay, we're going to start learning how to write styles in Imba. And this is one of my favorite topics because I find writing styles in Imba is the best way to write CSS. So we'll start by adding a CSS file included into our HTML template, add a bunch of classes and IDs everywhere, and then write selectors that reference those, right? No, of course not. It's much easier than that to write styles in Imba. And there's a lot to the styling system in Imba, but we're going to start with just the basics, which will be inline styles. Now, you may have heard that inline styles are evil and that you should never use them, but that's not quite true, especially within a component-based framework like Imba, and especially as you're prototyping and starting to build up your tags. Okay, so I've actually removed some of the basic styles that I had in our index.html file. So now we don't have any styles, and we're going to add some of them back in. So to create an inline style on this label tag, for example, we use square brackets. You just put square brackets anywhere within the tag here after the tag name, and then we can write the styles inside here. So I'll start with display flex, and that will bring these onto the same line. Line item center, gap 10 pixels, maybe 5 pixels. Okay, and you'll notice a couple things about the styling syntax here. First is that it's pretty much the same as regular CSS, but you'll notice a big difference here is that the semicolons are optional, even when everything's on the same line. So you can leave those off, and we almost always do that. Okay, now let's add some styling to habit group. So I want you to do this, so I'm going to paste in a challenge prompt for you. And what I want you to do is to convert the styles below into Imba syntax as an inline style on the self tag right here. So change this block of CSS into Imba syntax. You can follow how I did it in the example up here on habit item. Go ahead and try that. Okay, so to do that, we'll put these square brackets on the self tag here. Background color EEE, padding 10 pixels, border radius 5 pixels, border 1 pixel solid CCC. Great, so that worked well, but this style is a bit long, right? We don't want to write our styles in this huge long line. You could break this onto multiple lines doing something like this, but I'm actually going to show you another way to save space with this kind of a style in the next lesson. So you probably cringed when you saw how long of a line that we had going here in this inline style, and I promised that I'd show you a way to fix this. Imba actually has aliases for many commonly used CSS property names. So for example, display can be written as D, align items can be written as AI, and gap can be written as G. So now you can see we get the exact same result, but it's much shorter to write. Now, a lot of people see this and they hate it, but I really want to encourage you not to be so quick to judge it. And I want to say it's optional. You don't have to use this. You can write styles in the usual way. But let me address a couple of the common criticisms. Some people say that you want to use very clear variable names in your code, so you wouldn't want to have these shortened ones that are harder to comprehend. The thing is, CSS property names aren't really variables. They're unchanging. So once you've learned these shorthands, it's very easy to decode them because you know what they mean. And a big benefit of this is that you can type them faster because it's less keystrokes. And Imba developers believe that less keystrokes is very important, especially when you're typing something visual like styles, where you want to see the feedback quickly as you go. So you may think, how important could it be to save a few keystrokes? But when you're thinking of the styles and then they flow through your hands into the keyboard, it's like you're thinking the styles into existence. And a difference of a few keystrokes actually can have a large effect. And you may think it's too hard to remember all of these, but if you're using the VS Code Imba extension, you get autocomplete for all of these, so you don't have to remember them, and you kind of naturally learn them over time. I like using this so much that now whenever I go back to writing regular CSS, I instinctively write these shorthands, and it bugs me that I can't use it everywhere. But again, if you don't like it, it's optional, but I encourage you to give it a try. All right, I've pasted in a little challenge here. I just want you to try converting these to using Imba's CSS shorthands for the property names. Go ahead and give it a try. I wrote a little hint here with the ones that might be a little harder to guess. Go ahead and give it a try, and then I'll show you how it works. Okay, background color is BGC, padding is P, border radius is RD, and border is BD. We should get the same result after we save, after changing these. And there's actually quite a few more of these, and you can look up a list of all of them at imba.io. And like I mentioned, if you're using the VS Code extension, you'll get autocomplete for all of those, so they're very easy to discover. Of course, we're not going to always write our styles as inline styles. Let me show you another way to set this up. I'm going to cut out the inline styles on the habit group tag. And up here in the body of the tag, I'm going to add the CSS keyword and then paste the styles in here. You can see that we get the exact same result. And let me just try changing this to red. You can see the border is now red, just to prove that it's working. And when you're writing your styles out here, we now have the flexibility to move this onto multiple lines if we want. And you can write your styles pretty close to traditional CSS syntax if you want. But what's really cool here is that Imba's CSS blocks solve an important problem that occurs with CSS, which is that generally when you write your styles, they're global to the entire project. It's very common to have these global styles that interfere with each other, and then you start using very specific class names to get around that, and it can be a big pain. In Imba, the default is that styles are scoped. So the style block declared on the habit group tag only applies to tags that are part of habit group. So I'm going to add an additional CSS block here. You can have as many as you want. In this one, I'm going to start with a selector, label, and say BGC red for background color red. Now we don't actually have a label tag here, so let me add one. There's a label tag, hello, and we can see that label has a bright red background. We can't miss it, right? Now I did this so that we can prove to ourselves that the styles are scoped. So this selector, label, applies only to this label tag within habit group, and we have label tags in habit item, and they're used on all of these habit items, but they're not being styled by this CSS block, which is great because we're not accidentally styling things that we didn't intend. And we don't have to use a bunch of crazy class names because there's only one label tag in this very short HTML template, and so just using label as the selector is very convenient. But what if we did want to style more than just the label tag within this tag here? We can cut this out, and if we paste it at the root level of our file, like this, now this CSS block applies to any tag defined in this file. So when I save, we'll see that the label tag defined in habit group and the label tags defined in habit item all turn red, because this style is applying to all of them now. But still, this is scoped. It's now scoped to the file. So if we had another file that defined some other tags, this CSS block wouldn't apply to that. And we can prove this to ourselves too. If I change this to a selector of the body tag, and we say body BGC red, you can see it didn't actually change the body's background color, and that's because this is scoped to this file, and none of the tags in this file have body tags within them. So what if we did want to style the body? You can put the global keyword in front of CSS, and now these styles apply everywhere. So this is a lot like putting a traditional CSS file into your HTML template. It's global. So you have that option as well. So now we have a red background color, which doesn't look too pretty. So let's change this to a light gray. And let's delete this label tag because we just put that there for a test. And I'm going to change the background color of habit group to be white. Okay, and one note about the selector here. You can see in this CSS block, I didn't actually include a selector at all. That's the equivalent of using the self selector. So a CSS block with no selector will apply to the self tag, but we can just leave it off. And I'm going to put this back onto one line. Okay, now if you'd like to try this yourself, I want you to take the inline styles here from habit item and move them into the habit item tag as a CSS block, kind of like this. Don't forget the selector. You can use label as the selector. Okay, so here's how you would do that. We can say CSS, label, And then we just paste in these styles here. So I'll just copy and paste them. And we can delete this, and we should get the same result. I'll also mention if you have another selector nested under the first one, like div, and I'll put BGC red, then this selector will be scoped to the one above it. And if I had another tag inside of here, like a span, BGC blue, you can see that span tag is now styled blue, but if I add a span tag outside, this one's not blue. So you can indent to nest selectors within your style blocks. Okay, I'm going to undo all of that stuff, and in the next lesson, we're going to look at some more Imba CSS superpowers. So we learned that Imba supports these shorthands for common CSS property names. Imba also supports some custom property names that aren't part of CSS. And these are super convenient. I'll show you a few of my favorites, but you can also find all of them on imba.io. If you use the VS Code tooling for Imba, there's autocomplete with documentation for all of these. So one that you can do is size. I'll set size 200 pixels. And what this does is it actually sets the width and the height property, but you can just say size 200 pixels to make something into a square. I end up using this all the time. Another one is px. So if I say px 40 pixels, that's setting padding left and padding right. So it's padding in the x direction. You can also do py for padding in the y direction. And the same thing works with margin. So margin in the x direction would look like that. RDT is a shorthand for radius top. So it's going to set just the top left and top right border radius and not the bottom. And of course there's RDB, does the opposite, and there's left and right as well. Now some of the coolest ones are the shorthands for transform properties. So in CSS, when you want to rotate something, you don't type rotate, you type transform, and then you put the rotate function in there, and then you could say something like 20 degrees. The syntax is a little bit weird. It doesn't feel quite like regular CSS. Imba gives us custom properties for rotate, scale, and other transforms. So now you can just write it this way, and you could write scale 0.5. I end up using these transform properties a lot more because they're so easy to access. X and Y work this way as well. It's super convenient. It's kind of like the way you wish CSS worked. Anyways, that's just scratching the surface of what some of these custom properties can do. But I'm going to delete these because we don't need them at this stage in our project. But these are super useful, so I just wanted to mention them. So we learned before that Imba defines some of its own custom CSS properties. But Imba also defines some of its own CSS values for things like colors, font sizes, and other stuff. Now this gives us a nice built-in basic design system that we can use to make things look nice and keep them consistent. These custom values are heavily inspired by the Tailwind CSS project because they've done a really great job coming up with a good set of CSS primitives. So let's look at how it works. I'm going to set the background color here, and I want to use a named color. But all the named colors in regular CSS are so bright that they're mostly unusable for your real project. But Imba defines its own set of colors, which are used by typing the color name followed by a number. So if I put yellow 3, or yellow 2 is a lighter yellow, yellow 1 is a really light yellow, yellow 8 is a dark yellow, and so you can put any number from 0 to 8, and this works for red, green, blue, orange, yellow, pink, purple, and some other really nice ones like emerald, or rose, sky. And the grays are very nice as well, so you can say gray 5, let's do gray 3, and if you want a cool gray, you can type cool 3. And if you want an even cooler gray, you can type cooler. The same thing works for warm and warmer for a warmer tone of gray. So I'm going to use cool 1 for the background color here. And for the font color, I'm going to use gray 8, so dark gray. So in addition to colors, there's also built-in font sizes. And you can use extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. And so for medium, you can type MD, large is LG, and I'm going to use small, which is SM. All right, let's work on some of the styles here in habit group. I'm going to set this border radius instead of 5 to LG. So there's similar sizing that you can use for border radius properties, small, medium, large, etc. And this is going to be a lot easier to keep consistent. If I want to use this same border radius somewhere else, I don't have to remember that I used 5 to mean a sort of big radius. I can just type LG, and it's going to be much easier to keep things consistent. Okay, I'm going to go on a new line here so I have some more space. And I'm going to lay this out using Flexbox. So I'll do display flex, gap 10 pixels, justified content center. Okay, and don't worry, we're going to clean this up so it looks nice. But let me first add a shadow here. I'm actually going to remove the border from this. And instead I'm going to use a shadow. Imba has a shorthand for the box shadow property, which is just shadow. And you can actually use a value like large, small, medium here to quickly get a shadow. But I want a little bit more control. So I'm going to say Y offset 0, X offset 5, blur 15. And if I put black as the color here, it's way too dark of a black. But if I do something like gray 5, it's not going to blend nicely with the background because this is a fully opaque gray. It doesn't blend into the background. It looks like it's blending into the background because the background is gray. Now, if you want to see what I mean, go ahead and pause the video, set the background to something else, like try Emerald 4, and you'll see that it doesn't blend very nicely. So we want a color that has an opacity to it. You can do that by typing RGBA 000 for black and 0.2 for 20% opacity. This is the alpha value that corresponds to the A here, and that'll give you a semi-transparent black that looks nice, but it's kind of cumbersome to type this all out. With Imba's colors, you can type any of the Imba color names, including black and white, and then a slash, and then the amount of opacity you want. So this would be 50%, this would be 80%, and this would be 10%. So I'm going to try like 20%. I think that looks about right. But you can see it's much easier to type out a color with opacity in this format. Okay, our habits look really weird now, so let's go up to habit item and work on the styles there. So I'll set the background color here to cooler 2. Font size, I'm going to use extra small. Radius, medium. Size, 70 pixels. Remember that sets the width and the height property. Color, I'll set cool 5. And I'm going to do font weight 500. Now I'm using Flexbox already to lay this out, but I want to set it to flex direction column. Imba has a shorthand value for this, so that instead of writing display flex and flex direction column, you can just write display vflex, and that's going to set display flex and flex direction column. The V is for vertical flex. Now these things aren't fully centered, so I need to also add justify content center. And Imba has yet another property that combines both of these, which is JA center. That'll set justify content and JI items. So now you can see everything is nicely centered. Okay, so this is looking pretty nice. I'm going to remove one of the items here from our list of habits just to make sure that there's plenty of room to display everything here because you may have a very small browser window. But I hope you see how powerful Imba's built-in CSS values are. Of course, you can find them all at imba.io, and I find that this helps me, especially when I'm getting started, to choose values that look nice and keep them consistent. And as your project grows, if you want to, you can customize these values so you're not stuck with the same default values that every other Imba project has. But I find that these values are so sensible that a lot of the time I don't really feel the need to customize them. In CSS, you can style pseudo classes, which are those things for hover and active states where you can take a selector like label and then put colon after it, and then something like hover, and then you can write your styles for a label that's being hovered over. The syntax for doing this is slightly different in Imba, and it actually goes way beyond what you can do with regular CSS. In Imba, instead of pseudo classes, we call these modifiers, and it's a really powerful system. So let me show you how it works. In its most basic form, it's just like a CSS pseudo class, except you use an @ symbol instead of a colon. So the syntax is label @hover. And then I could put something like BGC red 5 here, and we'll just see that it works. So if you want to follow a very CSS-like way of doing this, you can do it just like in CSS. Remember that it's an @ symbol instead of a colon, and this works with all the regular CSS pseudo classes like hover and active and whatever else. But there's actually 3 ways to write this modifier. You can do it on the selector like we have here. But another way to do it is on the property name. So I can write BGC @hover colon, and I'll actually do cooler 3 here just to make it look more subtle. But check it out, the hover state is now part of the property name. And we can see that that works in the browser, and they don't have to be super disconnected. And there's even a way to connect these even closer together. The third way to write these modifiers is immediately following a value. So BGC cooler2 immediately followed by @hover colon cooler3. So that's another way to write it. And you can follow that with yet another one for active cooler4, I'll do in this case. And this is great because when you write out a property like this, you're usually thinking about, well, how should it look when it's hovered? And you can just write that immediately right here without having to create a new selector. And this could all work in an inline style. You can't write these pseudo classes within inline styles using regular CSS, but with Imba's modifiers you can. Now where this gets really powerful is that Imba has modifiers that aren't part of the CSS pseudo class system. Imba has its own custom modifiers that let you do all kinds of cool things. So I'll show you an example up here on body. We have BGC cool1. There's a modifier called landscape that I could use to say BGC @landscape colon, I'll do red 5 to make it very obvious. And check this out. This is actually going to create a media query for if the browser is in a landscape orientation, meaning it's in a wider shape. So when I resize the browser to be wider, it turns red. There's even a dark modifier. So I could say BGC @dark, and maybe I'll choose, black as the background there. This is for if the user has set the preference for a dark color scheme on their operating system, they would now have a black background. And actually, if you have that set on your computer, you should see that as a black background now. Okay, so these create media queries behind the scenes, but they're effortless to use. They feel just like pseudo classes, but they're even easier than pseudo classes because you can use them right in line, and you could even use these in inline styles. There's also breakpoint modifiers, which allow you to set up responsive designs very easily. Let's try one of those. I'll do BGC @XS, XS for extra small, and I'll just do the same thing with a red background so we can see it. And what this does is it's saying I have an extra small breakpoint, and as I resize, we can see the browser turns red right around this point. So XS is a preset breakpoint, and there's different ones for XS, SM for small, medium, large, extra large. But you could actually use your own custom value here. So if you wanted the breakpoint to be at 300, you can just type the number 300. So @300 creates a breakpoint at 300 pixels wide. And if you want the opposite, you can do exclamation point. Now it's gray when the browser is above 300 and red when it's below 300. You can also flip the SM, XS ones by using LT-XS. So that'll make it red when it's small and gray when it's big, instead of the other way around, like that. Okay, I'm going to remove those, and I have a challenge where I want you to try adding some responsive styles to our project. Okay, so I want you to add some responsive styles that make this page a little more appropriate on a wider screen. And our default browser here is super narrow within Scrimba, so we'll use the XS breakpoint modifier to say that the screen has become a little bit wider. And what you could do is change the size property to be 90 pixels on habit item. So if we go down here to habit item, we have size 70 pixels. So use the @XS breakpoint modifier to change this to 90 for when the browser is wider. On habit group, you could change this gap from 10 pixels to 30 pixels when the @XS breakpoint modifier applies. Okay, so see if you can set up at least those two styles, and you could add any other styles you want to have for when the browser is wider. And I wrote a little reference here for the syntax of modifiers. Go ahead and give that a try, and then I'll show you how to do it. All right, so down here where we have size, I'm just going to follow that with @XS colon 90 pixels. And now I'm going to resize the browser, and when it gets a little wider, those become 90 pixel squares. Okay, and then for this gap, let's try using the other style where we write the modifier on the property name. So I'll do G@XS colon 30 pixels. Let's test that that works. Yeah, so the gap between those is getting bigger now. And I think it would be fun to animate these. So I'm going to add, Imba has a shorthand for the transition property, which is tween. And I'll say all properties, 200 milliseconds with ease. I'll just paste the same thing in down here on habit group. Cool, now we have a nice animation as we hit that breakpoint. I've got an assortment of Imba styling features that don't really fit anywhere else, but are too cool for me not to mention. And we'll just go through these quickly so you're aware of them. In each one, I define a custom tag, and then I mount it. So it's an isolated little example. All right, the first one is conditional styles. So you can see I've mounted two of these conditional styles tags. One has a prop lights on set to false, one has a prop lights on set to true. And in order to change the color here from gray to red, I've set an inline style of BGC red 4, and then I said equals lights on. So this lights on prop, it's actually like you assign it to the inline style, and that's going to conditionally apply this style. If lights on is false, this style won't be applied. And you can have multiple inline styles. So you could have other styles here that are always applied, and then one here that's conditionally applied. You can even have another one that's conditionally applied with a different condition other than this. The next example is conditional classes. This is really similar to the last one, and I use this all the time. So in this one, instead of turning a inline style on and off, I'm setting a class equal to that same lights on prop, and then I've added a style rule that styles that class. And so you can have classes that are always there, or I can have another one that has a different value that's turning it on and off. So when you assign a class to a Boolean, that's going to determine whether that class is applied or not. And it's so common that you have little classes that act as flags that you either want to apply or not. Imba gives you this really great shortcut for doing that. The next example is class modifiers. So this is basically the same example as the last one, except instead of adding a CSS rule for .light, I was able to put it in line here by saying BGC gray 4 .light amber 5. Now, if you remember from CSS modifiers, the syntax is something like this, where you can immediately follow a value with a modifier. You can use classes as modifiers in this trailing modifier syntax in order to quickly set a property only for a given class name. Sorry, that should be back to light. So light is being applied conditionally based on this value, and if light is applied, BGC is going to be amber 5. The next example is interpolated classes. So let's look down here in imba.mount. I'm mounting several of these interpolated classes tags, and each one has a light type prop. And you can see up here that's defined. And so for one, it's off, another is go, slow, stop. So I'm passing in different strings. And what I want to do is, to the self tag, I want to apply a class with the name of the string that's been passed in. You can interpolate any string as a class name using these curly braces. So instead of .some class, you can instead write curly braces and then put a variable name there, and the contents of that variable will be the class name. And so the class name is going to be one of these strings that's getting passed in, and I've added styling rules for all of those with different colors. And then I also made the contents of this tag be the name of the class name just so we can see it. So this one has .off, this one has .go, .slow, .stop. So not only can you interpolate class names, you can also interpolate style values. So this tag has style that sets the self tag to be 20 pixels by 20 pixels. And then there's an inline style here on the self tag, which is BGC. So the background color is using an HSL color. If you haven't seen that, that's hue, saturation, and lightness. And the first value is an angle, which defines the hue, and then saturation and lightness. So you can define the angle with different values, degrees, radians, or turns, where one turn is 360 degrees. So if I put 0.5, we get a different color. I'll put 0.2, we get a different color. And what I want to do is actually use this prop, this hue prop, as the color here. So we can actually interpolate that in using curly braces right here before the units. The units are turn here. And so I'm going to put hue. And check out what I've done here. I did a loop for num in 0 to 10. And then I'm going to have 10 of these interpolated style tags where the hue is num times 0.1. All right, let's see how that looks. And we get this cool rainbow. But the point is, whether it's a string or a number, you can interpolate a variable into your CSS values. It's very useful. And there's some really cool examples that I could show you, but they kind of rely on some things we haven't learned about yet. But I'm going to show you anyways because it's just too cool. I'm just going to paste in an alternate version of this tag that uses a couple of things you haven't learned about, like this touch thing here, which is an event. And there's a new property here called val. And notice that I have a rotate property with val degrees. And I have an inline style here that's set to val does not equal 0. So this expression is going to return a Boolean, and that's going to conditionally apply this style. So there's some magic happening here with this touch.sync thing, but don't worry about that. We'll learn about it later. But check out what I can do now. I can click and drag on these, and they expand, and my dragging rotates them. It sets the rotate value. So obviously there's some magic with this touch.sync that's setting the val property. But the way I'm able to use it directly in my styles is I just interpolate it in here, so the rotate is val degrees. Really fun, and it's a very small amount of code in order to create something this interactive. It's great. Now, one thing you need to know if you want to interpolate style values is that you can only do this interpolating of style values within self. So it's not going to work on a CSS declaration that's applied up here, but it works on all the inline styles. And it will work if you define your CSS within your HTML, which I'm going to show you in the next example. So this next example is CSS in tags. And you can see I've got the self tag here, and then I have a CSS block indented inside of that. Now this will allow us to interpolate styles inside of it because it's inside of the self tag. And it's basically the same result as our first example from the last one. And one thing to note about this, whenever you put a CSS block inside of a tag like this, indented in, the styles here are scoped to that tag. So without a selector, it's going to apply to that tag, which means if I were to put a div tag here and indent this inside of that, these styles now actually apply to this div. All right, and the last example I have is Imba's shorthand for variables. So variables, sometimes called custom properties in CSS. The official syntax for this, it actually works in Imba. I have a little example of that here. Let me uncomment it. So you can define a variable with this double dash thing, and you can set the value to a color. Of course, I'm using Imba's colors here, but you can set any kind of value. And this is built in part of CSS. But then to use it, you say color, var, and it's like a function with this double dash. The syntax here is kind of a mess. It's not the most beautiful syntax. So that works in Imba, and that's the official CSS syntax. But Imba provides an alternate syntax that's a lot more convenient. You just use a $sign. So $sign primary color row 7. I've defined a variable called primary color with the value as row 7. And then you can see down here I use it, color primary color. You don't have to use the var function. You just do $sign primary color. And so I have an A tag selector and a button selector. And in both of them, I'm using primary color, secondary color, and I'm using them in different places just to show the value of using CSS variables. And you can see the button and the link here both make use of those colors. And if I were to come up here and change this to like blue 8, then it applies in both places because it's a variable. Cool, so hopefully you found those examples useful. This sort of concludes our lessons on CSS for now. Definitely check out imba.io if you want to read through all the details of all these different CSS techniques. And I went through these ones pretty quick because I just wanted you to be aware that all this cool stuff exists so that when you run into a situation where it might be useful, you remember it exists, you can go look up how to do it, or come back to this video as a reference. In this lesson, we're going to learn about data binding, which is a really powerful technique for very quickly hooking up interactivity in our app. I've changed around our code a little bit. I moved habit group up above habit item. I added some styles that we're going to use later in this lesson. And most noticeably, I added a green background to items that are done here. And I did that using a class called .done that's applied conditionally based on the value of the done prop. And then I style it here to add the green background. But the problem that we have in our system here is that clicking this doesn't actually change that background color. It's not updating the underlying data. And we can kind of prove this to ourselves if we put a div here and we output that value. So I'll output done. And now we can see the true value of this. It's true, false, true. And if I check the checkbox, that value is not changing. That explains why the background color is not changing. So we set the checked attribute to done, and that just sets the default value of the checkbox. It doesn't do anything to update the value of done when we click the checkbox. But we can really easily use data binding to fix this. So binding means we're going to hook up an input to a variable, in this case the done prop. Updating that input will update the variable, and Imba handles all of that, including re-rendering the view. So Imba has a special attribute called bind that you can add to input tags, and you set it equal to the value you want to bind to, which in this case is done, and let's try it out. Now you see not only does the background color change, but this value here, the true and false value, is changing, so we can see that we're actually updating the value of done. And then the tag re-renders with the new styles, and it's working nicely. But I don't actually want to use a checkbox here. I just put that because it was a quick way to build the UI, but I'd rather that these were buttons with no visible checkbox in them. So we can change label to a button tag, and then we can get rid of this checkbox. But we still need a way to do our binding. You can bind a Boolean to a button tag just like you can with a checkbox, and it works the same way. Clicking the button will toggle the Boolean value. So I want you to do this as a challenge. It's a pretty easy one. I've pasted in the prompt here. Change the label tag to a button tag, bind the button tag to the done prop, following what we did here, and then remove the checkbox. Just delete this line, and then test it out. Make sure it works. Go ahead, give that a try, and then I'll show you the solution. Okay, so we change label into a button tag. We add bind equals done, and then we delete the checkbox. Cool, that works, and you can see that not only can you bind a checkbox, you can also bind a button tag. But there's many more things you can bind, and you can find a list of all of them on imba.io, but one of the really common ones is a text input, so let's try that. And how about actually you do it? I put another challenge prompt here. What I want you to do is add an input tag with type equals text inside of the button tag, so somewhere in here, and then bind this new input to the name prop. That's this prop here. Give that a try. Make sure you run it and try testing it out and see how it works, and then I'll show you my solution. All right, here's how we do that. We can add a input, type equals text, bind equals name. Okay, that gives us a little text input here. And you can change the value. Let's put sleep. And you can see immediately as I type, it's updating the name down here below. So it's created a connection between the text input and the name prop. And we can see that reflected here. And the problem with our UI now is that we've got the input and this text both showing up. It would make a lot more sense if we had a way to go into an edit mode to see the text input. Then we could put a conditional here to say whether or not we're in edit mode and show the input if we are, or just the name if we're not. So let's add a new prop called editing, and I'll set it equal to false by default. And we'll use that to determine if we're in edit mode. So I can say if editing, show the input, else show the div. Okay, now we need a way to toggle this editing value. Well, we learned that we can have a button bound to a prop, and that will toggle the prop. So let's use that technique to toggle between edit mode and regular mode. So I'll put a button down here, bind equals editing, and we'll call that edit. And I added a style here, button.edit. So if we add the edit class, we'll get some nice styling on here. So we got a tiny little edit button. Clicking that toggles into edit mode. Let's do test. Click here, goes back to showing test. Great, so you can edit those now, but you probably also noticed when you click into these inputs, it's toggling the button behind it, so that's kind of weird. One way we could fix that would be to put the button inside of our conditional. So I'll take this button tag, put it down here. So now it's only actually a button tag if we're not in editing mode, and if we are in editing mode, we'll change it to a div tag. Okay, so editing mode, we have div.item, else button.item. Oh, and in editing mode, we don't need bind because it's just supposed to be a div. It's not supposed to change any values. Okay, so it works when we're not in editing mode. When we go into editing mode, this now changed into a div. So clicking in here doesn't change the value of the button. In the last video, we set up binding within habit item between name and this input type equals text, and done, and this button that goes around the habit, and between editing and this button here. There's also a way to set up binding between a value and a custom element, like a custom tag, like habit item. And there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to do this. You could imagine that you built your own type of little UI widget, like a slider or something, and you want to use it like an input. You need to be able to set up binding to your own custom tags as well. And let me show you why we kind of need to do that here. If I put a div here, do json.stringify, and I put our habits, so we can see all of our application data here. And now when I start interacting with this and changing some of the values, nothing in the original data is changing because the binding that we set up is all within habit item. And changing these values doesn't change the original values inside of habit group. So to fix that, it's actually really easy. We want to set up binding between the habits array and these two values that we're passing in here. But if I were to say something like bind equals habit, Imba's not going to know what exactly we're binding here. What are we binding to? Which internal values of habit item? And so the way we can tell it is that I want to bind name, and this refers to the name prop within habit item. So we use this colon to separate bind and then name, which is the value inside of habit item, and then here what we want to bind it to. And we actually want to bind it to habit.name. So let's try that. If I go to edit, now as I change this, you can see it's actually updating the name property on our original object. So it's changing the base data that is the data source of our application. Okay, now I've got a real easy challenge for you. Why don't you try setting up similar binding here, but instead of for name, do it for the done value. Okay, so all you have to do is put bind in front of this, and that's just saying that we're binding to the done prop within here, and we're binding it to habit.done. So whenever done changes here, it's going to set habit.done to that same value. And we can see that those update in our JSON that we're outputting. So then I can remove that JSON code just because that was for debugging purposes. And now we know how to bind into custom tags. All right, we finally reached this very important topic, which is events and event handling. In web applications, the UIs are driven by events, things like on-click, on-mouse-over, on-scroll. These are all defined by the DOM APIs. Imba, as usual, has an elegant way to respond to events. So I've added in a little button tag here to quickly show you the syntax for this. It's like adding an attribute to the tag, but it starts with an @ symbol and then the name of the event. So @click means click event, and then you set that equal to the event handler. Now this can be the name of a function that you want to call or a method, or it can be a little line of code right there which will act as the event handler function. So I'm going to put console.log clicked just as a test, and let's click the button and we see the console.log, so that works. A really cool thing is that the event object is automatically provided as a special variable called E. So I could just say console.log clicked, E, and we'll see that. So you can see that the event object is passed in, and that makes it super easy to define these event handlers for ones that are very quick and easy like this. But pretty often you're going to want to put a method name here. So if I put a method called foo, and then I could say def foo as a method on my tag here, console.log hello from foo. Okay, now when I click it, we get that. So foo here is a reference to the foo method, and that's what gets called. But let's make a more realistic example. I'm going to delete this button. Okay, I'm going to put a new div down here with a class of controls, and inside of there, I'm going to put a button tag @click equals complete all, and this button will be called complete all. Okay, I'm going to add some styles for this button. I'll say div.controls, and inside of there, any buttons are going to have these styles. Okay, so I styled the button to look like a link, and now let's implement this complete all method. So when you click this button, it's going to run a function called complete all, which is not defined. I don't need this foo method anymore, so I'm going to change the name of that to complete all, and let's just click once to make sure that that's hooked up. It is. So now we're going to define a function that completes all of the habits, and that's easy enough to do with a loop. I'll say for habit in habits, habit.done equals true. So this method will go through and complete all of the habits, marking them all as done. Okay, let's try that. Click here. Let's start with all of them incomplete. Click here, they're all complete. Awesome. Now an important thing to understand is how Imba re-renders your app. The way you should think about it is that every time an event is handled in your app, Imba re-renders everything. Now that might sound like, oh, that's inefficient, but imagine if it wasn't inefficient. It frees you up. It makes things so easy because every time an event is handled, your app is just fully re-rendered. So you don't have to worry about surgically updating any particular things. And that essentially is what happens, but Imba has a very sophisticated system for doing this very efficiently. So you might think, well, maybe it's just barely efficient enough, but it's actually way faster than other web frameworks. Like in most common cases, it blows past React and it blows past Vue. And you got the benefit of re-rendering your entire app on every handled event, which makes the model, sort of the mental model of building your UI much simpler. Okay, so we've hooked up this button to complete all. I'm going to add another button, and we're going to call this one reset all. And you can see that over here. And now I've got a challenge for you. I want you to hook up this button. What I want you to do is hook up the reset all button. Step one is create a reset all method, kind of like the complete all method that sets all the habits done property to false. Then add a click event on the new button that calls that method, the new method that you create, and then test it out. Give that a try, and then I'll show you the solution. Okay, so let's define the method, def reset all. And just like the one above it, we'll say for habit in habits, habit.done equals false. Then we'll come down here and say at click equals reset all. So now you can try either of those buttons. One will reset everything, one will complete everything. Okay, in this lesson, we're going to learn how to emit events, and we're going to use an example of deleting an item to show how this works. So we want to be able to delete one of these habits. I'll start by adding a delete button down in habit item. I've added a container around our edit button and added some styles so that I can add in another button below that, and I'll put delete as the label. So you can see that new button now appears under each item. So how do we set it up so that clicking this button actually deletes the item? Well, we're going to need some sort of an event handler on this button, a click handler, right? And we'll say console.log delete. And I often will just set up a console.log just to make sure things are hooked up correctly. So let's click delete, and we see delete, log to the console. Okay, so we know that that's working, but we need to actually delete the item from the habits array, the original data source, in order to have it be truly deleted. But habit item doesn't actually know about the habits array. It needs to communicate up to habit group, which does have a reference to the habits array and could delete the item. So how do we do this communication? Well, I want to mention the way that this would work in React, because a lot of people come from React, they try to do it the React way, which actually will work, but there's sort of a different way we tend to do this in Imba. So the React way to do it would be to define a function like delete item, def delete item, maybe add a specific index. I'll just put console.log deleted for now, but we'll actually implement this method later. And then you would say something like on delete equals delete item. And so you're actually passing in the event handler for habit item from habit group. You're passing down a function. Then you would go back to habit item, and for this where it says click, you would call that new prop that's being passed in. In Imba, we tend to do this a different way. So I'm going to delete this. What we tend to do instead is to emit events. So down here in habit item, instead of console.log delete, I'm going to type emit. And emit is a special Imba function that will emit a custom event. And the name of the event will be this string that we give it. So I'll say delete item. Now that I'm calling emit here, whenever delete is clicked, emit is called. And that means a custom event will be emitted. And we can handle that event up here within habit group on habit item, because habit item is what emits the event. So we can handle it just like we would any other event. Delete item. And then again, I'll just use console.log to make sure this works. So I'll click on delete, and it's working. So the event is emitted and then handled right here. And so what we'll do here is actually call the delete item function, and we need to pass it an index. Otherwise, it's not going to know which of the items to delete. So we need to get that index, which we can do by adding an I variable to our loop to store the index for each item as it iterates through, and we'll pass that into delete item. So this method, delete item, currently just logs deleted, and let's put index here too to make sure that that's getting passed through. So deleted 0, deleted 1. Now all that's left to do is to actually delete the item. So instead of pretending that we're doing it with console.log, we could say habits.splice index, 1. So the JavaScript splice method will remove items from an array, starting at an index and going for a given amount of items, in this case just 1. So now when I click delete, it actually deletes it. And we can delete another one. Great. So far we've written our whole project in one big file, and I want to start breaking it up into separate files. But before we do that, I want to show you an important concept in Imba about how you define tags and import them into other files. So as an example, I've set up this simple thing here where I'm mounting a div, and it just has the string food goes here. And I've defined some foods as tags in these two other files, breakfast.imba and dinner.imba. So let's look at breakfast.imba. I have 3 tags here: red apple, hot bread, and fresh egg. They each just have an emoji representing a food item. So I want to use these back in index. And so let's import some breakfast. I'll say import ./breakfast. And then down here, I'm going to put red apple, hot bread, fresh egg. So I've imported our 3 tags here from breakfast. But you'll notice that I didn't import anything specific. I didn't import those specific tags. I just imported the entire file. And if we go into breakfast, you'll see that I'm not exporting anything from this file. Okay, we'll come back to this. Let's look at the dinner file. In the dinner file, I defined 2 tags, rice bowl and too many tacos. Each of these is being exported. And you'll notice the way I've named these tags is actually different. These use a capital letter for each word and no dash separator. When we look at breakfast, these are all lowercase with a dash separating the words. So this naming convention is actually very important. When you name the tags this way, with all lowercase, Imba registers the tag as a global component. If you import the file that contains it once, anywhere, it's available everywhere in your project, just by virtue of importing it one time. While these ones, named with capital letters, have to be exported and then specifically imported to where you want to use them. So let's try that. Import rice bowl, too many tacos from dinner. Okay, let's try using that. Rice bowl, too many tacos. Okay, so we've got our rice bowl and we've got our tacos. But to use these ones, the ones with capital letters, we had to explicitly import those tags, and we had to explicitly export them from the dinner file. Now, just to demonstrate that once you've imported a file that defines these globally registered components, they're available everywhere, I'm going to go into the dinner file, and I'm actually going to make a new tag here called export tag breakfast for dinner. And inside of there, I'm going to use some of those breakfast foods. So red apple, hot bread, fresh egg. Now, the file that defines these tags is not imported into this dinner file. But just because it's imported here means that it's now available everywhere in my project, even in this file that doesn't reference it. So let's try this just to prove it to ourselves. I'm going to put a break here and then say breakfast for dinner. Oh, which I actually need to import. I almost forgot. So that one is a locally defined component that I need to import from the file it's defined in. And there's our breakfast for dinner tag. So to review, any tag named with all lowercase and dash separating the words is a globally defined tag that's registered as a web component. And any tag that's named with capital letters and no separators is a locally defined tag that needs to be explicitly exported and imported, which is handy if you want to ensure that this tag is only used in a particular subsection of your project. But in our project, just for convenience, we're using this globally defined tag strategy. So I just wanted you to be aware of the difference before we go to the next lesson where we're going to split up our tags into separate files. So far in our project, we have 2 tags, habit group and habit item. We're going to be adding some more tags, so I want to organize our project a little bit by moving these 2 tag definitions into their own files. And I've already created those files, so I'm going to come here and take habit group. I'll copy the entire tag definition, cut it, go to habit group, paste it in, back to index. And now if I save, the project is blank because we're referencing habit group right here, which this file doesn't know about. So we need to import habit group. So import./habit group. That's the file that defines that tag. And now when I save, everything works again. And let's do the same thing with habit item. But why don't you give it a try? Here's the challenge. Move this habit item tag definition into the habit item.imba file, and then import the habit item.imba file into this index file, just like I did with habit group. Go ahead and give that a try, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so to do that, we're going to select the entire habit item, cut it, go to the habit item file, paste it in there, come back to index, and we're going to import habit item. We can leave off the file extension. Okay, so now we're a little more organized. You may wonder, why are we importing habit item here when it's actually only referenced by habit group? It's not used in this file. And we could do that. We could do this import of habit item into habit group, because that's the file that uses habit item. But because these are globally defined tags, I think it's kind of nice to show all the imports here at the main file of our project, so we can see all the files that we're using. But it could work either way. Okay, I'm feeling really good about how we've cleaned up our project. Let's continue in that spirit by adding a container tag here that kind of wraps up our entire project. So I'm going to define a new tag called Dopamina Box, because that's the name we're using for this app that we're building. It's called the Dopamina Box. And inside of there, I'm going to have habit-group. And what I'm going to do is replace this habit group with Dopamina Box. But I deleted all the data that we were using that needs to be passed into habit group. So I'm going to make a prop here, prop habits equals, and I've just pasted in that same array. And then I'll make sure that I pass that down into here, habits equals habits. And I'm going to delete some of these items off of here. I'm going to make this a bit shorter, because ultimately we're not going to want to hard code any habits in here. We're going to have those all be provided by the user. But for now, we'll just keep this one. Okay, so now we have this container tag, Dopamina Box, and the point of this is to allow us to add other aspects of our app inside of this one container. Not everything has to live inside of habit group. In fact, I think these complete all and reset all buttons that are hanging out here aren't really part of habit group. Habit group should maybe be everything inside of this white box, and these are some extra controls that are separate from that. And it would be nice if those lived right here below habit group at this top level Dopamina Box tag. So I'd like to give you the challenge of trying to extract those controls from the habit group file and bring them here into the Dopamina Box tag. Okay, so I've written out the steps that you'll need to take in order to bring these controls into the Dopamina Box tag from the habit group tag. First, you're going to go into the habit group file and find the HTML for these controls. There's a div with these two controls in it. Bring that whole div over and paste it in here below habit group. Then go back to the habit group file and find the corresponding CSS for these controls and paste that inside our Dopamina Box tag definition somewhere here. Then the two buttons that we're bringing over each reference a method on habit group. So go into habit group, copy those two methods, delete them out of habit group, and paste them also into here on the Dopamina Box tag. Give that a try, save it, see if everything still runs, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so first we want to bring the HTML for those controls over. Let's go into habit group. And if we scroll down, we find those controls here inside of a div. So I'll select all of that, cut it, come back to index, and paste that in below habit group. If I save, I can see the buttons, but there's no styling. So let's go find that styling. If I go back to habit group, go up to the top, we've got a little CSS declaration here that's for div.controls. So I'll cut that, come back here, and paste it in. Now if I save, the styling is working, that's great. And the last thing I need to do is bring these methods. So these buttons call these methods complete all and reset all, which aren't defined here. So let's go into habit group, copy those methods out, come back to index, and we can paste them right here in our Dopamina Box tag definition. Okay, now if I save, I just want to make sure that this works. So if I reset or click complete all, that works. Great. Now this makes a little more sense because these controls are now separated from this list of habits, and we could move them on top or below, or we could put other stuff in between, and we will be doing some things like that. And the habit group tag now has an even more narrowly defined purpose, which is always nice when the components of your application have a narrow, specific focus, and they become easy to understand. Okay, so we've removed some of these hard-coded habits that used to be here, and now we just have one, with the intention that we're going to remove that one also because the user should be adding in all of their own habits. So let's add that method for the user to be able to add habits. We're going to have this new tag called habit adder, which I've written in here, but it's not actually defined. And I'm importing a file called habit adder, and let's go look at that file. It's a new file I created. And there's nothing in it except comments because I want you to create this habit adder tag, at least the basics of it, and then we'll add the functionality to hook it up and make it actually work. So to practice creating tags, I want you to follow the steps in this prompt here. Add a new tag called habit adder, give it a prompt called name set to untitled as the default string, then give it an HTML template starting with the self tag. Inside of there include a header tag with the content add habit. Below that, make a section tag. Inside of the section tag, put a input tag and use the bind attribute to bind it to the name prop. Wrap that input in a div tag. And below that div tag, put a button tag with the content of add. And then inside of this new habit adder tag, paste in all of this CSS. This will be the CSS for this tag. Okay, give that a try and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so we're going to make a tag called habit-adder with the prop name equals untitled. We'll have a self tag with a header, add habit as the content of the header, then a section tag. Inside of there, we'll have a input inside of a div. So I'll put the div and then input bind equals name. So it's bound to the name prop. And then a button tag with add, just add as the title. And then we're going to paste in all this CSS. So let me cut this out of here, paste it into here, indent it and uncomment it. And there we go, because we already had this file being imported into index.imba and the tag was being used there, it immediately shows up and that looks fine. So next thing we have to do is actually hook it up and make it work. So if somebody types in a name here and then clicks add, we need that to actually add the habit to this array. So let's learn how to do that in the next lesson. Okay, so we've added our habit adder tag, and what we're going to need to do is to send data from the habit adder to the Dopamina Box tag, which owns this array of habits, so that it can add the new habit to it. So to kick off this process, of course, we're going to need to emit some sort of event from the habit adder tag that the Dopamina Box can listen for. So let's go over here to habit adder, and where are we going to emit the event? Well, we're going to listen for an event when you click this button, right? So we could add @click and then do our logic there to emit the event. But maybe we shouldn't listen for clicks on this button, because what if you typed into this form field and then pressed enter? That should probably also send the event. So a better way to do this, maybe a more accessible way, would be to use a form tag and then listen for submitting the entire form. So let's add in a form tag here. So we'll say form, indent this stuff, and the button, I think we need to add type equals submit to make sure that it submits the form. And then instead of a click event on the button, we can add a submit event on the form. So we'll say @submit equals handle submit, and let's define that handle submit method, def handle submit. And inside of there, we'll do console.log hi, just to make sure that it works. Oh, and we broke some of our CSS. Let me quickly fix that. And now when I click add, we get our console.log with hi, which means that the submit event fired and called this handler. So that works when I click the add button, but it also works when I focus on this form field and press enter, which is one of the nice things about using the form tag with a submit event rather than a click event on the button. But if you look closely, you'll notice that every time this form submits, the page reloads. And we don't want that. We don't want the page to reload, but that's the default behavior of submitting a form. So to prevent that default behavior, the typical way you do this is you use the event object on the event handler, and then on that event object you call prevent default. This is all part of the JavaScript DOM API, not Imba stuff. So now when I click add, it doesn't reload the page. That's great. That's what we wanted. I can press enter, no more reloading. But I want to show you this extremely useful Imba feature called event modifiers. We've seen CSS modifiers. There's also a similar concept for events in Imba. So I'm going to delete this and show you another way to get this same prevent default behavior to work. When we write our submit event here, we can just use the modifier prevent. And you use modifiers by putting a dot after the event name and then the modifier name. So prevent is one of Imba's event modifiers, and there's a list of all the event modifiers on imba.io in the documentation. So the prevent modifier will do the same thing we just did of calling e.preventDefault, and let's test out that it works. So we'll click add, hit enter. It doesn't reload the page, that means it's working. Cool, so this syntax is very clean, very nice, very easy, but this didn't save us that much code, right? It's not so useful. I like it, but it's not the most useful thing in the world. But there's a lot of event modifiers that do even more complicated things that are so handy. Let me show you an example of one. There's one called throttle, and you can actually chain these together. So we can say submit.prevent.throttle. So throttle is another event modifier that will throttle this event. That means you can't fire this event more than once per unit of time, and the default is 500 milliseconds. But you can actually pass your own time value here, like a function. So I'll put in 1000 for 1000 milliseconds or 1 second. And now when I click add, we get our hi message. But if I click add twice, we still just get 1. So if I click a bunch of times within 1 second, it only fires once. That's the behavior of throttle. So let me try clicking 3 times. Still just 1. Now if I continually click, we only are going to see that event fire once per second. So imagine that you needed to throttle an event, especially something that fires really frequently like a mouse move event, and you wanted to set up throttle behavior. What a pain. You don't want to have to do that. You can use this event modifier. It makes it super easy. Okay, but we don't actually need to throttle this one, so I'm going to remove that. And I'm going to show you a couple more examples. I'm going to add something to the self tag here. Let's add a click event. And there's a modifier that's called log. It's the log modifier. And I can't tell you the number of times this comes in handy for me to just quickly test that an event is working. So we can say click.log, and you can pass in a value here. So I could say .click. And this event is on the self tag, so clicking anywhere on habit adder should fire this event. And we see the message logged there. So just a quick way to log a value and check that your event is working. Let me show you another modifier. Click events have modifiers such as shift. So now when I click, it doesn't fire the event, it doesn't run the log. But if I hold shift on my keyboard and then click, now it runs that event. So if you needed to set up some behavior for a shift click, all you have to do is add the shift modifier to your click event. Super easy. And you can use alt. There's a modifier for alt. So if I hold the alt key, I get it. If I don't hold that key, I don't get it. Let's look at one last example. We'll do mouse move.log move. You can see as I move over here, we're firing tons of events, way too many events. Let's add throttle here. So .throttle.log. Now that's firing only every 500 milliseconds. And we could put .alt. So now as I go over here, nothing's happening. If I hold alt, now we're getting the throttled event. Okay, so there's a quick overview of the event modifier system. But all we need to use for our example right now is the prevent modifier to prevent the form from reloading the page when you submit it. So now we're ready to continue on hooking up this event adder so that it actually adds the event. We'll continue that in the next lesson. Now we're ready to actually hook up the habit adder. And to do that, we want to use our handle submit event. And inside of here, we want to emit an event that the Dopamina Box tag can listen for. Okay, so I want you to give that a try. This is your challenge. If you remember how to emit events, call the emit function here to emit a new habit added event. So we call the emit function with habit added as the string name of the event inside of this handle submit method, and then add a listener on the Dopamina Box tag that logs got it when the habit added event is received. So that means you go to the Dopamina Box tag inside of index.imba, and on the habit adder tag, you're going to listen for the event that you just set up on habit adder. Go ahead and give that a try, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so we're going to say emit habit added. That means whenever this method is called, Imba will emit a custom event called habit added. So we'll go to the parent tag of habit adder, which is Dopamina Box, and find where habit adder is, and we want to listen for those events. So we'll say at habit added, and we want to log some message just so we can check that this works. And we could say equals console.log, but now we know about modifiers, we can just say habit added.log. Got it. Let's try this. So clicking this add button runs the handle submit method, which emits the habit added event. And we see the message logged here because we've handled it right here. Let's go back to habit adder. I'm going to remove the challenge. And the next thing we need to do is find a way to pass along the value of name along with this event. So how do we pass data along with the event? Well, the emit function accepts a second parameter, which can be any data that you want to pass along. And oftentimes we'll pass an object with a bunch of values, or you can just pass in a single value. So I'll pass name. Name is this prop here. That's the one that we want to send. So this now emits an event called habit added, and it passes along the value of name. So let's see how we access that on the other side inside of the Dopamina Box tag. So instead of this log modifier here, let's change this to an actual event handler. We'll say handle habit added, and we have to define that method. So I'll put that here. I'm going to put the event object as a parameter, console.log hello. Let's just make sure this is working. We should get hello. Cool. So we passed along, in addition to the name of our custom event habit added, we also passed along a second parameter, which was some data, which was that name value. How do we access that? Well, it's passed along on the event object under the detail property. So e.detail is the value that we passed to the emit function. So I'm going to log that. And before I click it, think about what you're going to see when I click this. Do you have a guess? Untitled. And let me try changing this to test. And we see test. That's because the name prop in the habit adder is bound to this form. So whatever I type here is the value of name. And name is what we passed along here. And it gets sent along as the detail property of the event object. I feel like detail is not the easiest to remember name, but just know that detail is where the data that's sent along with a custom event is stored. So now that we have a reference to that new name, we can create a new habit. So let's say const new habit. We'll make a new habit object with name equals e.detail. Done is false. And ID equals nano ID. We'll talk about that in just a second. So there's a new habit object. Let's push it onto our habits array. That's this prop here. So we'll say habits.push new habit to push that onto the end of the array. And let's give it a try. Cool, it works. And we can click it, we can delete it, we can edit the name, everything works just like any of the other habits, but now we can add our own habits. So that's great. And I want to reiterate how the rendering works in Imba. In Imba, your UI is re-rendered every time an event is handled. And this is an event handler. It's handling the habit added event, which is a custom event we defined. And so when we update the data, when we update the habits with a new habit, because this is in an event handler, Imba is going to re-render the UI based on the latest data after that happens. And the new data includes a new habit. So when it re-renders the UI, we see the new habit here in our UI. So I said I would explain why we have nano ID here. So nano ID, I'm including this nano ID NPM module. And we used nano ID briefly earlier in the course, you may remember. I import it here, and nano ID is basically a single function that returns back a string that is a unique ID. So it's basically a random string, and you can use it as an ID for objects. Comes in handy when you need it. Okay, let's go and do one more quick thing in habit adder. Forgot to delete this old challenge. I'm going to give you a new challenge, which is it's a real simple one. I want you to reset the value of the name prop after submitting the form. So right now, if it says test and I submit it, it still says test. I want it to reset back to untitled. See if you can make it do that, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, to do that, all we need to do is set the value that we want here. So we can say name equals untitled. And that's after we've done this emit and sent along the name value to be handled by Dopamina Box. Then we just assign name back to untitled. And let's test it out. Cool. Maybe this would be nicer as an empty string rather than the word untitled. And then we could use a placeholder on our input here, placeholder equals habit name, something like that. So now we have a little message, habit name, then we can type it in, exercise, add, and then it resets. Cool, so now we can actually add our own habits into our dopamine box. We can add them and delete them and edit them. It's starting to have all the functionality that we need. Okay, we're going to take it up a notch and start adding some visual interest to our app. We're going to add some icons. And I've already added a folder in the Explorer called Icon Graphics that's full of nice little icon graphics that I got from an open source project called Health Icons. I also added a file called icons.imba, and this is a big object that has keys that map to other objects, which include a title, which is the title of the icon, and then an SVG property, which includes this import statement for the various icons, the SVG icons. So when we actually use this object, the SVG property will have the SVG code on this property. So let's take a closer look at that. Let's go to Habit Adder. Let's import that big icons object. So we can say import icons from /icons. That's the icons.imba file. And then I'm just going to come down here somewhere in the Habit Adder and let's put a div. And I'm going to say icons. And I want to put one of the keys from that icons object here. So let me go into icons.imba and I'll just pick this first one, objects cleaning. I'm going to copy that, go back to Habit Adder, paste it in here, and I'll say .title. Okay, so we see the title of that one printed out here. Let's try, instead of printing out the title, let's print out the whole thing, but it's an object. We need to turn it into a string, and we can do that using json.stringify, which is built into JavaScript. And let's see what we get. So we can see the whole object now. We see title, cleaning, and then SVG, and it's all this SVG code. So we want to see the actual icon, right? So let's try this. We'll use an SVG tag. Now Imba has a really cool feature where there's a non-standard source attribute that you can add on an SVG. So we all know about image source. In Imba, you can do SVG source. And you could put the path to an SVG here, and that would work. But in our case, we have references to the actual SVG code, and that works too. So we can say icons objects cleaning .svg. And so .svg is the actual SVG code. Let's see if it works. Delete all of this. And there we go. We've got a little broom. Okay, a quick little challenge for you. Try changing this objects cleaning to a different icon. You can find a different key from the icons.imba file and paste it in here. Okay, so let me try that. I'm going to go into icons.imba and let's see, emotions confused. I'm going to try that one. I'll go back to Habit Adder, paste it in there, and we've got a different icon. Okay, so we're just exploring how this works, but ultimately what we're going to want to do is list out all the icons in the Habit Adder, and we'll remove the functionality for typing in a name, and we'll have people just choose by clicking on one of the icons. But we're also going to want those icons to show up here as the actual habits instead of text labels. So let's go into habit item and play around with it there. I'm going to copy this import because we're going to need that. I'll go into habit item, paste that in, and let's try this. Down here where we have the name, let's try doing SVG source equals icons name.svg. Now if the name is one of the keys of this icons object, we'll see the corresponding icon. But clean up is not one of those keys. So we're actually probably going to get an error. Yeah, we get an error because this icon's name is icons clean up, which doesn't exist, and trying to access the SVG property of something that doesn't exist gives us an error. We can put two dots here, which is Imba's syntax for optional chaining, which means if this is defined, give us the SVG property, otherwise give us back undefined, and it will avoid the error. Okay, so we're printing out the name, and then we're printing out the SVG if it exists, which it doesn't. So let's add a new habit with a name that we know matches one of the keys of the icons. So we'll go into icons.imba. This time I'm going to choose a different one. I'll paste it in here as the name, click add, and cool, now we see the actual icon show up in our habit, along with the name being people_agriculture. So ultimately, we're not going to want to show the name. and we'll have something like this. So now that we have some basic familiarity of how this icons file that I've provided you with a list of all the icons works, and how SVGs can be used in Imba, we're ready to move on to the next lesson where we'll start to build out the actual UI to allow you to pick icons and have the habits be icons instead of text. It's going to make this app a lot more fun. All right, now I know we're eager to add all the icons into our habit adder and make this into an icon chooser, but I first want to set up the layout of our entire app inside of the Dopamina Box tag, and we're going to add a really fluid layout with the habit adder expanding up and hiding away with an animation. And this will be real easy to set up. Okay, so I'm going to add in a few HTML tags. I'm going to put div.container, and inside of there I'm going to put a div with a class of panel area, and I'll put habit group inside of there. And I'll put this div.controls that we already have also inside of panel area. Okay, after panel area, I'm going to have div.chooser area. And inside of there, I'm going to have a div.chooser. And inside of there, the habit adder. Okay, so let's save that. Not much has changed, but I have some CSS that I wrote ahead of time, which I'm going to paste in, replacing our existing CSS. Actually, I first have some global CSS that we can add here, which defines a bunch of CSS variables and sets a body background color. And then for the CSS directly on habit area, I'll paste that in there. And I made a little mistake here. This was supposed to be indented inside of container. All right, that's what I was expecting to see. Now we've lost our habit adder, right? It's gone. Let's look at the CSS here. We can see chooser area, which goes around habit adder, has a height of 0, and overflow hidden. So its height is 0 and overflow hidden means you can't see anything inside of it. But check this out, right below there, there's something that says if it has a class of on, then its height is 100%. So let's try adding a class of on to chooser area. And now we see our habit adder pop up from the bottom. And I notice the panel area is kind of crashing into the top. Let's add a padding top of panel-space. That's a CSS variable that I added. And that looks nice. Okay, so we've got this drawer that can be shown or hidden where we're going to have our icons in our habit adder. And I want to hook this up so that we can actually toggle it. We can hide it and show it. And doing that is as easy as adding or removing this on class, which we have right here. But we're going to need some sort of a button that's going to toggle it. I think we don't actually really need this complete all button in our final product. So let's replace that and we'll use it as a button that will show and hide the habit adder. Now I want you to set this all up, so I'm going to make it a challenge. Okay, so I've wrote out the steps that you'll need to take to hook this up. First, add a new prop on the Dopamina Box tag called show adder and set it to false. So you can add that prop maybe right above this challenge prompt or below it. Then replace the complete all button or modify it to become a toggle button. So make the label be toggle. And then add an event handler that would actually toggle the show adder value. So you could make an inline event handler, or you could make a method that handles that event. And it should just flip the value of show adder from true to false or false to true. And then last, you're going to conditionally apply this on class. So remember, any class name, you can set it equal to a Boolean value, and we're going to set it equal to show adder, which means that we'll be conditionally applying on, which should show and hide the drawer. So go ahead and try setting that all up, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so the first step was to add a prop called show adder, set to false. Then we're going to replace the complete all button and make it a toggle button. And instead of complete all, this is going to be toggle adder. Okay, that'll be the name of a method that I'll define here. And let me find where we have complete all. We're not going to need that anymore, so I'm going to delete it. And I'll say def toggle adder, which will take the show adder prop and set it equal to not show adder. And the last step was to conditionally apply this on class. So we can say .on equals show adder. So if show adder is false, which it currently is, this class will not be there, which means that the height of chooser area, according to the CSS rule, will be 0. But if we click toggle, that value should become true, and that should apply this class, and that should make the height be 100%. Let's try it. Cool, and you can see it has a nice animation. Now I'm going to move the show adder prop up here to the top so we can kind of keep our props together. And we now have a nice template in our Dopamina Box tag that defines the major areas of our app and allows us to do this nice animation. And we have these specific tags for the different functionality within them. Also, we're kind of collecting all of our methods that modify the data inside of Dopamina Box, and we'll continue with that. But now we're ready to go in and set up our actual habit adder with the icons, which we'll do in the next lesson. Oh, and before I forget, these buttons have the wrong CSS, don't they? They should be more like little links. There we go. All right, now it's time for us to set up this habit adder area to have a big list of icons to choose from instead of a name that you type in. Because we're going to be working on the habit adder, it's going to be really annoying if every time we reload the page, it's hidden. So let's make it open by default by saying show adder is true. It's also bothering me that the default item here is blank. So why is that even happening? It's because the name that we have for our default habit item is clean up. And that's from before when we were just typing in whatever name we wanted. But now the names are corresponding to keys in the icons object. So let's pick a key from here. Let's go with Dizzy. And we'll go back to here and let's paste in emotions underscore Dizzy. And now we see the corresponding icon show up because we already modified habit item to show the icons corresponding to the name that we give it. All right, now let's go and set up our habit adder. Let's go to habit adder, and we're going to make some big changes here. So we're going to delete most of the code out of the render method, delete all the CSS and the name prop. I'm going to delete all that stuff. And here inside of section, we want to loop through all of the icons and display all of them inside of buttons. We know how to loop through arrays, right? We can say for item in list, and that's how you loop through an array. But to loop through an object, it's slightly different. We would say for own key, comma, value of object. So that's the syntax for looping through an object in Imba. Now the object that we want to loop through is icons, and we can name these something else. So key will actually be name, and value, I'm going to call it icon. So let's put a div here, and let's just write name to see what we get. And we see all of the keys of the icons object. That's good. Now let's change this to an SVG and say src equals icon.svg. Remember that Imba allows us to use a source attribute on an SVG tag. That's a special Imba feature. And inside of our icons object, each of the icons has an SVG property that has all the SVG code for an icon. And if you pass that code into the source attribute, Imba will render it. So let's save, and we see all of our icons showing up. That's great. Now I'm going to add a little bit more HTML here. We want these to be buttons, so I'm going to put a button tag around our SVG. And I'm going to put one additional div here that's just for the benefit of our styling. Div with a class of icon view. Then I'll indent the SVG inside of that. And we can delete this comment. And I wrote some CSS ahead of time that I'm just going to paste in here. So let me just come in here, paste in the CSS. And now we have some nice looking buttons. And this is a really cool layout because this drawer, it toggles and it fills up as much space as it can, leaving just enough space for the habit group at the top. So if I make this bigger, we can see more icons. And if I make it wider, it's a really nice grid layout that presents all the icons. And where it runs off the bottom, it scrolls. So the user can scroll down to see all the icons and you'll be able to click them to add it. But that doesn't work yet, so let's hook it up. So of course we're going to need some sort of a click event on this button, and then we want to do basically the same thing we were doing before where we emit a habit added event with the name. But of course in this case it's not the name that was typed in, it's the key of the icon that we're now calling name. So I think this would be a good challenge for you to give this a try. And here it is, I've typed it out. Now this challenge could be a little bit tricky because I haven't specified exactly how to do it. You have to figure it out a little bit. But what I want you to do is to make this work so that when you click one of these buttons, these button tags here, which is any of the icons in our preview here, when you click one, it should add it to the habit group. We should see it across the top. So you need to figure out how to make an event handler that will emit the correct habit added event along with the correct value for name. Go ahead and give that a try. Don't worry if you get stuck because I'm going to show you how to do it in just a sec. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need to do is add a click to here. And what's going to happen when we click? Well, we have this existing handle submit method, and we could make use of that. Let's try that first. So we'll say handle submit. And if we do that, there's not going to be any value for name. Like, where is name coming from? So let's try clicking, and you see we get something empty here. And this part here resets name to an empty string, which is not really relevant anymore. So how do we get name into here? Well, we could add a name parameter to this handle submit method, and we could actually just pass it along here so that when you click, handle submit gets this name, which is defined right here. Let's try that. Cool, that works. Now, handle submit is not really the right name because we're not submitting a form anymore. It should be handle click. But I think even better would be just to take this and make this a one-liner, paste that in there. We don't need this handler at all. Delete all of that. And now we just have at click, emit, habit added with name, and that's this name here. So that should work. Let's make sure. Cool. Okay, our habit adder is looking really nice now. Let's make some other improvements to the app to make it look even nicer. First of all, I think these blue icons are a bit too bright blue, so I'm going to change those instead of blue 5 to cooler 5, which is a cool gray. I think that looks nicer. Maybe cooler 4 would work. Yeah, I want those to be pretty subtle. Now let's go into habit item and make some changes there. We're going to get rid of these edit and delete buttons. So I don't think we need edit at all. We're just going to delete that. But delete, we still need to be able to delete these, but we're not going to use that button. So I'm going to comment this out just so we can see how we're doing it here. And then let's delete this comment. Since we're not going to have editing mode, we can delete all this stuff about editing. We indent this back over. And we don't need this prop for editing mode anymore. And so there's how it looks. Now let's fix this delete item thing. We're going to need a way to delete the items, but I don't really want to have any buttons in the UI for it. I think one cool way to do it would be to have a click event on button that deletes them. So I'm going to say click equals emit delete item. And let's test that out. So if I click one of these, it gets deleted. But that's how you toggle the items, right? So we can't use click for this because that's supposed to toggle them. What if we said click.alt? We use the .alt event modifier for click, and that will mean it only deletes it if we're holding Alt while we click. So we do an Alt click, deletes it. It's awesome how easy it is to add that type of functionality, and I feel like it works well enough. Keeps our UI very streamlined. I think that's good. Now let's go to habit group, and I'm going to remove some of the styling here. I'm going to remove the background color and this padding. I'm going to remove this whole row. I'm going to remove this shadow. And I'm going to let those just float in the middle of the page without any sort of container around them. Okay, I like how that looks. So here on habit item, we added this at click.alt equals emit delete item. So when you click holding Alt, it's going to emit a delete item event. And habit items are inside of habit groups. You can see here inside of habit group, we loop through our habits and make a habit item for each one. And that's where that delete item event is listened for. We emit it from a habit item and we listen for it inside of habit group. And it calls a delete item method, which is this method here, that deletes the item from the habits array. But I don't like that we are modifying the habits array within habit group. I think it would be nice if we centralized all of the logic that modifies our list of habits inside of Dopamina Box. So habit group is inside of Dopamina Box. And because this is sort of the root level of our application, I think it should do all the modifications to the habits array so that we keep all that logic in one place. And we already have reset all and handle habit added here. So I think we should have a delete item method here as well. But if we go back to habit group, this is where we're listening for delete item. But we want to start listening for it. Instead of listening for it here, we want to listen for it inside of Dopamina Box, because that's where the method's going to be. So I'll comment that out. So how, though, are we going to get this delete item event from habit item up to Dopamina Box? Well, that's the way events work in JavaScript, is they propagate all the way up through their parent tags So we don't have to do anything special to make that work. We can actually just listen right here for delete item equals, and if we call the method delete item, and I'll put the actual implementation here with just console.log, this should delete something. So now if I try clicking with holding Alt, it's going to emit the event, which will be listened for here inside of Dopamina Box. And we see that message logged out. Okay, but of course we need to actually hook that up. And if I go back to habit group, we still have our delete item method here, which we want to remove. Okay, because I don't want to do this manipulation here inside of habit group. But I think finishing this will be a good challenge for you. Okay, so I've pasted in a challenge prompt here, and the first two steps are things I've actually kind of done for you already. Remove the delete item method from habit group. So inside of habit group, I already commented that method out, and I commented out the event handler. We're not going to need those anymore. Add a new delete item method to Dopamina Box. I've already added that for you here, except the body is fake. It just logs this message. Now, the last one's the important one. I want you to make any modifications necessary to the code so that deleting works. Okay, because right now, clicking one of these doesn't actually delete, it just logs a message. So figure out how to make it actually work. I'm leaving this a little bit open-ended, and I want you to explore and try and figure it out. See how you would do it. If this was your project, what would you do? Keep in mind one big difference here is that in the previous way this was working, an index was being passed. As we loop through each of these, we get a reference to I, which is the index of these items, and we passed that to delete item, and that was how we removed the item. We found the item in the habits array by index and removed it. But over here, we don't have an index. When we listen for the delete item event, we're not in a loop, so we can't be listening for an index. So you'll have to come up with a way to identify the item so it can be deleted. There's a variety of ways you could do it. Give it a shot. If you find yourself doing something really complicated, changing tons of code, you're probably on the wrong track. But also, feel free to modify code in any of the files, do whatever you need to make it work. Give it a try, and then I'll do my version of it. All right, here's how I'm going to solve this problem. The first thing is, inside of this delete item method, I'm thinking, okay, how do I delete this item? And then I think, wait, which item? How do I even know which item initiated this click? So we need to solve that. Before, we were passing in an index of the item, but we don't have an easy way to get the index here. So let's go to where this event is being emitted on habit item, and we know how to pass along some data along with a custom event. The second parameter to emit. We could pass some reference to the item here, but habit item only accepts a name and a done. Neither of those can be used to uniquely identify the item. For example, the name might be duplicated, so we can't really rely on that. But we do have an ID that we assign to all of our habits that uniquely identifies it, so maybe we can pass that in as well. So inside of habit group, that's where we use these habit items, and let's just pass in ID equals habit.id. Now inside of habit item, we can make a prop for that, prop ID. We'll use that here. We'll say ID as the second parameter for emit. So now habit items know their own ID, and they can send that along when the delete item event happens. So we'll go back to Dopamina Box, and inside of delete item, I want to get access to that ID. And remember, that's going to come on the event object. So I'll put the event object as a parameter here, and I'll do console.log e.detail. So if you remember, any custom values that you pass along with an event come through on the event object's detail prop. So if I option click here, we should see an ID. There it is. Now we just have to use that ID to find the relevant item and remove it from the array. So we can change this to say const ID to delete equals e.detail. And now we need to search through our array, find the ID of the one that we want to delete, and create a new array without that item in it. One easy way to do that is to use the built-in array.filter method. So that would allow us to say habits equals habits.filter. So we're reassigning habits with the result of habits.filter, which is going to return a new array with some items filtered out. And we want to filter out the item that has this ID. So filter takes a callback function, so we can say do, and then the parameter is going to be each item of the array in turn, so each habit. So I'll just use the letter H as a stand-in for that. And the body of this function should be a function that returns true or false, depending on if it's an item we want to filter out. So we want to filter it out if its ID, h.id, equals ID to delete. Let's see if this works. Add a couple items, option click. And I got that backwards. So we actually want to return false if the ID matches and true otherwise. So the items where this function returns true will be kept in the array. The items where it returns false will be filtered out. So option click one of these. And now it's working nicely. Cool, so there's different ways you could do this, but I think this filter method makes it pretty easy. Now I'm just going to remove some of these comments and I'll go into habit group where we left a couple of commented out things that we don't need anymore. So let's just delete those. And now we're all set. I think it's really nice that we have all of the array manipulation inside of Dopamina Box at this root level of our application. The next thing I want to do is set up persistence so that we can save the data, and when we reload the browser, that data will still be there. But there's one remaining little thing that I want to fix before we do that, which is very similar to the last thing we did where we moved delete item up into Dopamina Box. I want to also remove toggle item into Dopamina Box. Right now, that's also handled on individual habit items using this bind. We say bind equals done, and that's going to change the done prop. And because habit group also uses bind with done, it's binding from habit group into habit item, and habit group has a reference to the original array, so it's adjusting the value in the original array. Now I think bind has served us well, but it's time for us to break free from bind and use regular events to set this up so that we're doing all the data manipulation inside of our Dopamina Box tag, which will keep things a little bit more clean. And we're not even allowing editing habit name anymore, so we can definitely remove bind for that one. And we're just passing in a regular old prop now, habit.name. And we're going to do the same thing for done. Back in habit item, we want to follow what we did for delete, and we'll remove bind, and we'll say at click, so this will be click without alt, equals emit toggle item, and then pass in the ID as the second parameter. Now if I go back to my Dopamina Box tag, I can listen for that event here on habit group, just like we're doing with delete item. So I'll say at toggle item equals toggle item. Now I just need to implement this toggle item method, def toggle item e const ID to toggle this time equals e.detail, because we've passed along the ID as the second parameter to emit, which comes through on the detail prop of the event object. Now that we have the ID, we just need to adjust our habits array to have that item be toggled. And there's various ways to do that. I'm just going to loop through, say for habit in habits, if habit.id equals ID to toggle, then habit.done equals not habit.done. So this little bit of code will loop through each habit if it finds the one with the ID we're looking for. So let's make sure that still works. If we can still toggle these, I think we're good. Okay, now that we really have all of our methods that manipulate our application state up here in Dopamina Box, it's going to be easy for us to implement our persisting of data, because all of the places where we need to persist data are the places where we change the data that underlies our app. And those are all right here, easy to find, so we'll do that in the next lesson. Okay, now we're ready to add the big missing feature in our app, which is persisting data. Usually persisting data is done using a database, and you have to set up servers and stuff and do network communication. We're going to keep it real simple and use the browser's local storage API to store some data in the user's browser. That means there's no servers involved, it's real easy, and as long as they're continuing to use the same browser, they'll see the same data after they reload the page or come back another day. Now I've made some little helper functions that I'm importing here that will help us to use local storage to persist data. So we have persist data, load data, and clear data. Those are all defined in persist.imba. Persist data will store some data that's passed into the browser's local storage. Load data will retrieve that same data. And clear data will delete all the data under our local storage key. If you never used local storage before, you don't have to worry about it because these little helper functions are going to be all we need. Okay, so to make use of these, what we're going to do is instead of having a habits array here, we're just going to say load data. And I set up the load data function to return an empty array if there's no data already stored, which will be the case the first time we run this. Now I'm also going to make a persist method. So we'll say def persist, and inside of there we'll say persist data, which is the helper function I made, habits. So we're going to call the persist data function with the habits array, which represents the whole state of our application, every time persist is called. So if you reset all habits, we should call persist. If you add a habit, we should call persist. If you delete an item, we should call persist. And if you toggle an item, we should also call persist. So after doing any of those things that change the data, we save that data into local storage so that if the user reloads, every time they reload, load data will be called and the data that had been stored will be loaded in. Okay, so we should try it. But I want to do one thing first. Because local storage is local to my browser and to your browser, we could be a little bit out of sync. You might have different data in your browser than I do in mine. In fact, I do have some already stored in mine because I was working on this lesson before I started recording it. So I see a few habits here, but I'm guessing you don't. So I'm going to make a button that resets the local storage so that we're both on the same page. And I'll just add that button here where we have these other little buttons. And we'll say button at click, handle clear data. And the label will say clear data. And then I'll make this method def handle clear data. And that will call clear data, which is one of the helper functions I made. And then it will also set habits equal to an empty array. So now I'm going to click clear data. That cleared out mine. Yours should be unchanged, but you can see if I add a couple items and then I click clear data, it clears it out. Now if I reload, still cleared out. Now we can test it. So I'll add a few items. I'll toggle a couple of them and I'll delete one of them. And then when I reload, we get all the exact same stuff, even after reloading. So that means our app is persisting the data. Let's also try this reset all, reload, that works. And it would be easy enough to store this toggle property, but I don't think that needs to be persisted. So we're just storing the state of this habits array, which represents this list of habits. And now this app is actually kind of usable. You could actually use it. You could come back the next day and you would see the same data and you could check off the habits. So something that's been bugging me here is when all the habits are empty, the habit row kind of collapses down. So when I add one, everything shifts down a bit, and if I clear them out, it shifts up. Let's see if we can fix that. We'll go into habit group, and we can see here where we're looping through all the habits. If there are no habits, there's going to be nothing looped through here, and div.group is going to be empty. Now the size of div.group, the height of it, is kind of dependent on the height of habit item. So if we were to try to put a fixed height on this group div that matched the height of habit item, we would need to later change that if we ever change the height of habit item, and it could be a little bit messy. So I've got a little idea here. Let's first make a variable that we can use in our render method called empty. So I'm going to put def render here, and that's going to give us some space here to define some variables. So I'm going to say const empty equals habits.length equals 0. So now we have this little Boolean. Hey, let's go ahead and use the question mark to make it clear that we're storing a Boolean. And then I'm going to say if empty habit item. So now we have a habit item here whenever the list is empty. And if I add something, that's replaced with the thing that I added. So if I clear it, we have just that one there. But it's a bit weird because this is still a button and it's like an empty habit item. So let's just hide it. Let's put a little inline style here, say visibility hidden, and I'll do PE none to make sure it can't be clicked. That's pointer events none. I misspelled visibility, I think. Visibility. Cool. Now we have the correct height without anything showing up in it, but it looks a little bit weird because it's just completely empty. So let's add a little bit of styling to this group when it's empty. So we can say add an empty class, like .empty equals empty. So that will conditionally apply this class. And then we can style that class. I can say up here, if it has an empty class on the group tag, then let's do radius medium, shadow, X offset 0, Y offset 0, blur 0, 2 pixels for the spread value, and then the color will be cooler 2. Now we just get a faint outline where there should be a habit, and when we add one, it replaces that. If I delete it, we got the outline back. And that's a nice little touch for our app there. Imba tags have a set of lifecycle methods, methods that are called by Imba at various times on your tags. If you go to imba.io and read the documentation, there's a list of all the different lifecycle methods you can use, but we're going to go over a couple of them. And render is actually a lifecycle method because it's called automatically by Imba every time the view needs to be updated. Let's log render inside of the render method, and we'll open up the console so we can keep track of this. So you see render is called when the page is first loaded, and then it's called basically anytime I change anything, the view needs to reload, re-render, and so we just see render, render, render. It's called several times. Let's add in another lifecycle method. There's one called setup. I'll do console.log setup, and that's called very early on in the process when the tag is first created. And so that one is called once, and then render is called, and render will be called repeatedly as I interact. But setup is just called at the beginning. There's another one called mount. Let's see when that one is called. So we see setup, render, and then mount. So mount is actually called the first time the tag is mounted to the document. And so it's only called once at the beginning, but render is called before mount. So you can see now if I interact with the app, render is called several times, but setup and mount were only called once. There's another one called rendered. See if you can guess when that's going to be called. So it's called right after render, every time a render happens. Now these are there for your convenience. There may be times when you need to do something after every render. Setup and mount are pretty common to use. And in this one, we're going to use setup because I have a challenge for you where I want you to adjust some of the props in this tag before it's rendered. Okay, so there's your challenge. Make the habit adder appear on the first run if there are no habits. And what I mean by that is if there's no habits and you load this page, you should see the habit adder. But if you already have some habits, then we don't need to do that and we can just toggle it based on whether you click here. And that's because when you first come here and you don't have any habits, you definitely need to add one. So we should by default show the habit adder. Remember we have a prop that controls this called show adder. So set this prop appropriately within setup based on whether there's already any habits. Go ahead and give that a try, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so inside of setup, we're going to say if habits.length equals 0, meaning there's no habits, then show adder equals true. We're going to force that to be true if there's no habits. Okay, so I'll save that, and already I see it's working. The adder is appearing because I have no habits. Now if I add a habit, and then I reload, it doesn't appear. That's what we wanted. So this is kind of the default state of our app. But on that first run, when you have nothing here, it shows the habit adder. All right, because this project is called a dopamine box, the idea is that once you've done all your habits, something a little bit fun is going to happen to make it feel enjoyable to finish all the habits so that you'll want to use it again the next day and it motivates you to do your habits. So to provide that little bit of joy at the end, let's use a sound effect. I've included a library called Howler. I've added it as a dependency, which can play sound effects. And I've also added a sound file here, celebrate.mp3. So let's import howl from Howler. And I've read the Howler documentation, and it says to import this Howler class. And then to make an instance of that class, which I'll do as a prop on Dopamine Box. So I'll say celebrate sound equals new howl. And the way this howl class works is it takes a configuration object, and we just need to add a source property that points to our sound effect, celebrate.mp3. Now that we have this prop, we can call the play method on it to play the sound effect. And I want to do that inside of toggle item. Now we want to make sure that we only do this once we've toggled all the items to be done. But for now, let's just put it in here, and I'll call the .play method. And this will happen for any item that gets toggled, just so we can see if it works. Okay, so I'll add a few habits, and when I click one, I hear the sound. Of course, it's playing for all of them, which we'll fix in a minute. Now, you're hearing the sound through my computer speakers into my microphone. If you want to hear the sound play on your system, you can pause the video and interact with the app in the browser. Okay, so now let's fix this issue and make sure that it only plays the celebration sound after you've finished all of the habits. And that'll be a challenge for you to do. So I've pasted in a prompt here. What I want you to do is modify the toggle item method so that it only plays the sound when you're finishing the last habit item. Okay, so see what modifications you can make in here to have that work that way, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so there's a variety of ways you could do that. I'm going to do it by making a variable called remaining, set it equal to 0, and then for each iteration of this loop, I'm going to increment remaining with remaining plus plus unless habit.done. So if the habit's done, don't increment remaining. That means if all of the habits are done, remaining will be 0 at the end, and I can say if remaining equals 0, play the sound. Okay, so I'll try that. Add in a few habits. I don't hear any sound. Still no sound. And checking off the last one plays the sound. Now, there's another issue that we can address here, which is when you check this last item, all your items are still done, and it kind of feels like they should reset after you finish. So we could come here where we say celebrate sound.play and do reset all, which is a method we've already implemented for resetting everything. And then if I come in here and I check these all again, here comes the last one. You can see that it reset them all, but it happens so fast that it looks like the last one doesn't even get clicked. Let's try it again. Here we go. So it's much too fast. What we can do is use set timeout to delay that method call. So we could say set timeout. We'll use the ampersand trick, do 1,000 milliseconds, and put a trailing callback after that. So reset all will be called 1 second after this line of code runs. Let's try that. Here comes the last one. They're still green. And I'm waiting. 1 second is probably passed by now, and they haven't reset. So what's going on? Well, remember that in Imba, the UI updates every time an event is handled. So when you trigger an event and handle it, the UI refreshes. Toggle item is being called in response to an event being handled, but this set timeout is making some other code run 1 second after that. So Imba will have already attempted to refresh the UI, and then we're going to run this extra bit of code that doesn't tell Imba to reload the UI. In fact, the data behind the scenes has already updated, but Imba just hasn't refreshed it. So if I do something else here, like toggle our drawer, that is going to trigger Imba to update the UI, and we'll see these habits go to the correct state. There it is. So in cases where you use set timeout or some other method of calling code that modifies the data that underlies your UI outside of an event, you need to use imba.commit to manually tell Imba to refresh the UI at this point. So let's try it again. Now I click the last one, wait 1 second, and they reset on their own. So if these were my habits and I came in here early in the day and said, okay, I cleaned up, later in the day I washed my hands, and then at night I go, oh, I did my walk, so I'm all done with my habits, let me click this. Hear my little celebration, and it resets so it's ready to go tomorrow. And because this data is all stored in local storage, when I reload the page tomorrow or open it up tomorrow, I should see the exact same data there. They'll all be reset. And so now we actually have a real app. You could actually use this to track your habits if you wanted. Well, you made it to the end. That was a lot of material to take in, so good job. In order to really cement what you've learned, I recommend building a small project of your own. Try starting with something super simple. You don't want to get carried away. You could even rebuild a similar project to the Dopamina Box that we just built. And when you get stuck, consult the Imba docs, which I've got the link here in this slide, and feel free to ask questions on the Imba Discord. Again, it's a great resource. There's a lot of people there happy to discuss Imba and answer questions, including me. And when you finish with something, whether it's a project or an open source library, share it on the Imba Discord. We love seeing what people have made with Imba. And I also think there's not enough content about Imba out there on the internet, like blog posts and videos. So if you discover something or learn something or get past a tricky problem, Please share your knowledge. Write a blog post, a tutorial, record a screencast. It would be great to add to the Imba knowledge that exists on the internet. And please contribute to the Imba documentation if you find it lacking in any way. Everyone in the Imba community is really eager to improve the documentation. Okay, so thanks again for taking the course, and I look forward to seeing what you create.